The chalk dust stuck to the back of the throat, a dry, powdery grit that turned every swallow into a chore, coating the tongue until speech felt like grinding two stones together. Arthur Vance shifted his weight, wincing as a jagged flint dug into his thigh through the thin wool of his trousers, and balanced the small, leather-bound notebook on the top sandbag of the parapet. He dipped the nib of his fountain pen into the inkwell, watching the black liquid tremble slightly with the distant, rhythmic thump of heavy artillery miles away, perhaps near Albert or maybe closer, near the ruins of Thiepval, where the German lines held firm against the summer heat. "Dearest Mother," he wrote, the letters cramped and careful to avoid smudging on the rough Hessian surface of the bag. "The weather here remains uncommonly dry, though I suppose you would call it stifling rather than pleasant, and the air is so thick with pulverized stone that one tastes the very earth one stands upon." He paused, lifting the pen. 50 yards out, beyond the tangle of rusted barbed wire that looked like a child's game of cat's cradle spun by a giant, a figure lay draped across the strands. The body wore the field grey of the enemy, or perhaps it was a boy from the Norfolks who had gone over 2 days ago. The sun had bleached the uniform to a nondescript pale brown, and the flies had done their work so thoroughly that the shape no longer suggested a man so much as a bundle of discarded rags left out for the rag-and-bone man. Arthur's eyes skipped over the wire, fixed instead on a tuft of green grass struggling to survive in a shell scrape near the trench line, a splash of color that felt obscene in this landscape of gray and ochre. "Elsie writes that her piano lessons have resumed at the hall in Camden Town, which gladdens me greatly," Arthur continued, the nib scratching softly against the paper, a sound almost lost beneath the low murmur of men talking further down the communication trench. "Do tell her that I retain a vivid memory of her playing that Mozart sonata last Christmas, and that the memory serves as a sufficient antidote to the cacophony of our current surroundings." He stopped again. The lie tasted worse than the dust. There was no music in his head, only the ringing silence that followed the whine of a shrapnel shell, a high-pitched keen that lingered in the ears long after the explosion had faded. He looked at the dead thing on the wire. A boot had slipped off the dangling foot, revealing a sock with a hole in the heel, a mundane, domestic detail that struck him harder than the sight of the shattered limb above it. He dipped the pen once more, forcing his hand to steady, and added a line about the rations being adequate, though the bully beef had been tinned in 1914 and possessed the texture and flavor of wet salted cork. A shadow fell across the page. "Don't fret yourself over the mud, Titch," a voice murmured, low and raspy, "though I suppose today it's just the dust trying to choke us before the Boche decides to send a proper parcel of high explosive." Arthur didn't look up immediately. He finished the comma after cork, capped the inkwell with a thumb that was stained black at the cuticle, and only then turned his head. Corporal Bertie Higgs crouched beside him, knees drawn up to his chest, a cigarette cupped in a hand that bore the scar of a shrapnel graze from Mons. Bertie's face was a mask of dried sweat and chalk, his eyes crinkled at the corners not from mirth, but from the perpetual squint required to keep the grit out. "It's not mud today, Bertie," Arthur said, closing the notebook and sliding it into the inner pocket of his tunic, next to his heart where the fabric was worn thin. "It's flour. We're baking in an oven that someone forgot to grease." Bertie chuckled, a dry, hacking sound, and struck a match against the sole of his boot. The flare of sulfur smelled sharp and chemical, cutting through the sweet, cloying stench of unburied flesh that drifted up from no man's land whenever the breeze shifted from the east. He inhaled deeply, holding the smoke in his lungs for a second before exhaling a thin blue stream that curled upwards and dissipated instantly in the hot air. "Flour, is it?" Bertie tapped the ash onto the toe of his boot. "Then we'd best hope the Germans don't decide to be the baker. I've always found their loaves a bit heavy on the explosive filling." Arthur watched the smoke rise. "Did you see the runner go past?" "Socks, aye, he was moving like a rabbit with a fox on its tail. Stole a tin of peaches from the captain's dugout not 10 minutes ago. Claimed he found them lying about in the mud and thought they looked lonely." Bertie's grin faltered, just for a fraction of a second, his gaze flickering involuntarily towards the wire, towards the dangling boot. He didn't mention the body. Neither did Arthur. Instead, Bertie reached into his own tunic and pulled out a small, oilskin-wrapped packet. He peeled back the layers with practiced, deliberate slowness, revealing a notebook bound in waterproof canvas. He opened it to a fresh page, the paper crisp and white against the grime of his fingers. With a stub of pencil, he wrote something quickly, the movements economical and precise. Private unknown, Royal Norfolk Regiment, approx. 19 years, blue socks, hole in left heel. Found Sector 4, wire line, 1400 hours, 12 July 1916. He didn't sigh, he didn't shake his head. He simply closed the book, slipped it back into the oilskin, and tucked it away next to his cigarettes. "Reckon the captain will miss those peaches?" Arthur asked, his voice level. "Reckon the captain won't notice anything until a shell takes his legs off," Bertie replied, lighting the end of his cigarette from the dying ember of the first. "That's the trouble with officers, Titch. They look at maps, not at men, or at peaches." A whistle blew, sharp and piercing, from the direction of battalion headquarters, 200 yards back along the zigzag of the trench. It wasn't the charge whistle, it was the summons. "Vance," the shout came from further down, carried by a runner whose face was obscured by a layer of dust so thick he looked like a statue carved from chalk. "Lieutenant Thorne wants you, dugout, now." Arthur stood up, his joints cracking in the dry heat, and brushed the white powder from his knees. "Duty calls." "Try not to let him talk you into volunteering for a wiring party," Bertie said, standing as well and stretching his back until his spine popped. "And if he starts talking about violin concertos, just nod and look serious. He's been at the bottle again, or so Sock says." "He doesn't drink, Bertie." "Everyone drinks something out here, Titch. Some drink rum, some drink courage, and some drink madness." Bertie clapped a hand on Arthur's shoulder, the grip firm and grounding. "Go on then, don't keep the gentry waiting." Arthur turned and began the crouching shuffle towards the rear, the trench walls narrowing as he moved away from the front line. The air grew cooler here, the smell of cordite replaced by the damp, earthy scent of the deep dugouts and the metallic tang of the field telephone cables that ran along the duckboards. He passed men sleeping in niches carved into the chalk, their faces slack and grey, and stepped over a coil of telephone wire that someone had left lying in the path. The entrance to the officer's dugout was marked by a sign handwritten in bold black letters, BNHQ. Inside, the air was still and heavy with the smell of stale tobacco and wet wool. Lieutenant Julian Thorne sat at a makeshift desk constructed from packing crates, a single candle guttering in the draught from the entrance. He looked up as Arthur entered, his face pale but composed, his uniform brushed and pressed with a fastidiousness that seemed alien in this subterranean world. "Arthur," Julian said, his voice smooth and polished, devoid of the rasp that afflicted the rest of them. Come in, close the flap behind you, there's a good chap. The dust is quite intolerable today." Arthur pulled the canvas flap across the entrance, plunging the room into a dim, flickering light. "You summoned me, sir." "I did." Julian dipped a pen into an inkwell that looked suspiciously like a captured German pickle jar. "I require a message delivered to Major Go at the forward observation post. Nothing urgent, merely a confirmation of the evening's roster." He began to write, his hand moving across the paper with a steady, elegant rhythm, the loops of his LS and GS perfect and unshaken. "How is your mother, and little Elsie? Does she still persist with those piano lessons?" "I recall she had a particular fondness for Mozart." Arthur blinked, thrown off balance by the domesticity of the question. "She does, sir. She's playing sonatas now." "Splendid, simply splendid." Julian didn't look up. "Music is a vital tether, Arthur. One must hold on to it, lest we drift entirely into the barbarism." He signed the paper with a flourish, the nibs scratching loudly in the quiet room. "There, take this to the Major, and Arthur. So, do try to avoid the sector near the wire on your way back. The snipers are particularly active this afternoon." Arthur took the paper, folding it carefully. "Very good, sir." He turned to leave, pushing the flap aside and stepping back out into the trench. The light was beginning to fail, the long summer day giving way to a twilight that would soon bring the cover of darkness and the renewed activity of the patrols. He walked briskly, eager to deliver the message and return to the relative safety of the front line, to Bertie and the dust. He reached the corner where he had been sitting an hour before, the spot where he had balanced his notebook on the sandbag. The ground was gone. A fresh shell crater, 20 feet across and steaming in the cooling air, had swallowed the parapet, the sandbags, and the tuft of green grass. The edges of the hole were jagged and raw, the chalk walls exposed and gleaming white in the dusk. Arthur stopped, his breath catching in his throat, and stared at the devastation. His notebook was gone. The inkwell was gone. The spot where he had sat, writing lies to his mother about adequate rations and piano sonatas, was now a void in the earth, a gaping mouth that had eaten the last hour of his life without a sound. He looked down at the message in his hand, the paper crisp and clean, and then back at the crater. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the wire, the flies continued their work on the bundle of rags, and the wind began to pick up, carrying the first cool breath of the night. Steam curled off the raw chalk lips of the crater, twisting into the twilight like ghosts escaping a grave. Arthur stood frozen, the folded order sheet crinkling in his grip, his boots rooted to the duckboards mere inches from the drop. The heat radiating from the fresh earth hit his shins, a damp, cloying warmth that smelled of sulfur and turned stomachs, distinct from the dry, flowery dust that had coated his tongue only an hour before. Where his notebook had rested, balanced precariously on a sandbag stuffed with wet wool, there was now only a void, a jagged maw that had swallowed the ink, the paper, and the careful lies he had constructed for his mother in Bloomsbury. Gone! He blinked, the afterimage of the page still burning behind his eyelids, the neat script of Dearest Mother erased as cleanly as a slate wiped by a schoolmaster's rag. Bit of a bother, that. Bertie Higgs materialized from the shadows of the communication trench, his silhouette jagged against the fading grey of the sky. He did not look at the hole, nor at the shattered remnants of sandbags scattered like confetti along the parapet. Instead, he focused entirely on striking a match against the sole of his boot, the flare of sulfur briefly illuminating the deep lines etched around his eyes. Bosch must have spotted your pen, Bertie said, shielding the flame with a cupped hand that trembled slightly, though whether from cold or the day's exertion was impossible to say. Writing home is a capital offence in their book, Titch, treasonous, even. They didn't see the pen, Arthur replied, his voice sounding thin, stripped of the camaraderie that usually buoyed them. They saw the movement, or just luck. Luck is for horses and officers, Bertie muttered, finally lifting his gaze to the crater. He took a long drag, the cherry of his cigarette glowing bright orange in the gloom, casting fleeting shadows on the white walls of the new excavation. And we have neither. Still, could have been worse. Could have been you in there instead of your diary. It wasn't just a diary. Arthur stepped closer to the edge, peering down into the darkness where the trench floor used to be. It was the letter to Elsie. I'd told her about the piano. Bertie shifted his weight, the leather of his boots creaking in the silence that followed the explosion's echo. He reached into the breast pocket of his tunic, fishing out a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle that he handled with the reverence of a priest holding a sacrament. Then you'd best hope she remembers the tune without the sheet music, Bertie said, unwrapping the bundle to reveal a small black notebook, its corners softened by moisture and grime. He flipped it open with practiced ease, the pages rustling softly, and pulled a stub of pencil from behind his ear. What was the name? The lad on the wire, the one you were trying not to look at while you wrote. Arthur flinched, the question landing like a physical blow. 50 yards out, draped over the rusted tangle of barbed wire like a discarded coat, the figure remained motionless, a dark smudge against the lighter chalk of no man's land. He had spent the last hour angling his body, hunching his shoulders, carefully editing his vision to exclude the sight of the dead man's boots, one laces undone, pointing skyward in a silent accusation. Private Miller, Arthur said, the name tasting of ash. No relation to socks, I don't think. 4th Bedfords, joined Tuesday. Tuesday, Bertie repeated, the pencil scratching against the waterproof paper. 4 days, short innings, that. He wrote something quickly, his handwriting cramped and hurried, then snapped the book shut and tucked it back inside his tunic, right against his heart. I'll make sure his mother gets the story, such as it is. Better than the form letter they'll send her, telling her he died for king and country without mentioning he tripped over his own feet in the mud. You carry all of them? Arthur asked, turning away from the edge, unable to bear the sight of the hole any longer. Every name, Bertie confirmed, lighting a second cigarette from the first before tossing the butt into the crater. Someone has to remember the details, Titch. The official record won't care that Jenkins hated the color blue or that Smithers could mimic a sergeant major's cough to perfection. They'll just get a number and a date. I keep the rest. A shout erupted from further down the line, sharp and urgent, cutting through the settling dusk. Rations, get the bleeding rations up before dark. Sox Miller scrambled around the corner, his face smeared with soot, a sack slung over his shoulder that bulged with suspicious, rectangular shapes. He skidded to a halt when he saw the crater, his eyes widening as he took in the destruction, then narrowing as he spotted Arthur standing empty-handed. Blimey, Sox breathed, dropping the sack with a clatter of tins. What happened here? Did a bloody elephant land? Whiz-bang, Bertie said succinctly, leaning against the trench wall and exhaling a plume of smoke that mingled with the rising steam. Took Titch's letter home, and half the parapet. Sox whistled low, crouching to inspect the damage. Lucky it didn't take your head, mate. Would have been a shame to lose a writer. We need someone to tell the folks back home how lovely the scenery is. He grinned, a flash of white teeth in a blackened face, then reached into his sack and pulled out a tin of bully beef, tossing it to Arthur. Here, officer's quality, found it lying about near the Coe's dugout, figured it looked lonely. Arthur caught the tin, the metal cold and heavy in his palm. You stole that from Major Go. Borrowed, Sox corrected with a wink, insisting he won't miss it, not with all this excitement. He jerked a thumb towards the crater. Besides, you look like you need the strength in it. Writing letters is hard work. It was, Arthur said, running his thumb over the lid of the tin. Now I have nothing to write on. Plenty of paper in the HQ, Sox shrugged, hoisting his sack back onto his shoulder. Just ask the lieutenant, who's got stacks of the stuff he uses to draw maps that don't match the ground, but he's got plenty. Arthur looked back towards the dugout entrance, the canvas flap still swaying gently from his earlier exit. Inside, Julian sat with his steady hands and his perfect loops, discussing Mozart and sonatas as if the world hadn't just opened up and swallowed a piece of his history. The dissonance jarred against his ribs, a physical ache that had nothing to do with the shelling. I can't go back, Arthur said, more to himself than the others. Not yet. Why not? Bertie asked, pushing off the wall and crushing his cigarette under his heel. Julian won't bite. He's too polite for that. He asked about Elsie, Arthur murmured, staring at the tin in his hand, and then he asked about the piano. His hands didn't shake, Bertie, not once. Bertie paused, his expression shifting, the fatalistic humor draining away for a fleeting second to reveal something harder, more wary. Hands are tricky things, Titch. They do what they're told until they don't. He signed the order, Arthur insisted, feeling a sudden, irrational need to defend the illusion of normalcy that Julian clung to so desperately. Perfect signature. Clear head. Keep telling yourself that, Bertie said softly, turning to walk back towards the fire step where the evening sentries were beginning to take their posts. Just don't be surprised if the music stops one day and he can't find the sheet to start it again. Sox clapped Arthur on the back, a blow so heavy it nearly knocked him off balance. Cheer up, mate. At least you've got dinner, and look on the bright side. What bright side? Now you don't have to tell your mum about the rats, Sox grinned, gesturing to the darkening trench where the first shadows were lengthening, stretching out to touch the edges of the crater. Some truths are better left unwritten. Arthur looked down at the bully beef, then at the hole where his words had been, and finally at the dark expanse of no man's land where the dead man's boots still pointed at the indifferent sky. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay, whispering through the wire with a sound that might have been a violin or might have just been the wind. He pocketed the tin and turned towards the dugout again. There was more paper inside. There had to be. The canvas flap smelled of wet dog and stale tobacco smoke. A thick, cloying blanket that dropped the temperature 10 degrees the instant Arthur ducked under it. Inside, the world narrowed to the flickering glow of a single candle stub trapped in a glass hurricane lamp, its flame trembling not from draught, but from the distant, rhythmic thump of heavy artillery walking the line 200 yards forward. Dust motes danced in the cone of light, swirling in lazy, indifferent spirals above the rough-hewn table where Lieutenant Julian Thorne sat with his back straight as a ramrod, a fountain pen poised over a sheet of requisition paper that looked absurdly white against the grime of his tunic. "You're back then, Vance." Julian did not look up immediately. He finished the loop on a capital T, the ink flowing black and glossy, before capping the pen and setting it down with a precise click that echoed too loudly in the confined space. "Sock said you had paper," Arthur said, his voice sounding flat, stripped of the air outside. He shifted the bully beef tin from one hand to the other, the metal sweating condensation onto his palm. "Plenty," Julian gestured to a stack of foolscap beside a map case, the edges crisp, untouched by mud or blood or the greasy fingerprints that marked every other surface in the battalion. "Help yourself, though I'd advise against using the goods stationery for lists of rations. Socks has a habit of turning requisition forms into gambling debts." Arthur stepped closer, the chalk dust on his boots leaving faint grey smears on the wooden floorboards, each step feeling like an intrusion into a sanctuary that shouldn't exist this close to the lip. He reached for the top sheet, the paper cool and smooth under his thumb, a texture so alien it made his skin prickle. "How is Elsie?" Julian asked suddenly, his head tilting up, eyes bright and focused with an intensity that felt manufactured, like an actor holding a pose too long. "Still practicing the Moonlight Sonata. I recall she struggled with the Adagio sostenuto. Too much passion, not enough control." Arthur froze, the paper halfway to his pocket. The question hung in the air, delicate and terrible, a porcelain vase balanced on the edge of a shelf in an earthquake zone. "She's fine," Arthur said, forcing the words out through a throat that felt packed with cotton wool. "Practices every evening. Mother says the neighbors complain, but she ignores them." "Good," Julian nodded, a sharp, jerky motion that cut the air. "Ignore them, for Camden Town needs music. God knows we could use a bit of it here, although the only concerto on offer is the German heavy battery playing a rather repetitive variation on C major." He laughed, a short, dry sound that cracked at the edges, then immediately smoothed his expression back into neutrality, picking up the pen again as if the interruption had been merely a minor bureaucratic hurdle. "Did you need anything else, Private?" The shift in address landed heavy, a sudden reinstatement of the chasm that rank had dug between them, wider now than the trench itself. Arthur looked at Julian's hands, resting on the table beside the map case. They were steady, perfectly still. No tremor in the fingers, no white-knuckled grip on the wood, just the calm, pale repose of a man sitting in a study in Bloomsbury waiting for tea. It was wrong. Everything about this dugout was wrong, from the clean paper to the upright posture, but the hands were the worst offense, a lie so blatant it made Arthur's stomach turn over. Outside, men were being shredded by shrapnel, their names scratched into waterproof books by corporals who knew the odds were stacked against memory itself. And in here, Julian Thorne was discussing piano sonatas with the detached politeness of a host at a dinner party. "Just the paper, sir," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, retreating behind the wall of protocol Julian had just erected. "Thank you." "Carry on." Julian dipped the pen again, the nib scratching against the paper, a sound like tiny teeth gnawing on bone. He wrote 3 lines, stopped, stared at the ink, then crossed them out with a single violent slash that tore the fiber of the page. Arthur turned to leave, the paper clutched tight in his fist, the bully beef tin digging into his hip. He reached for the canvas flap, his fingers brushing the rough fabric when the ground beneath them lurched. Not a shake, a heave. The candle flame snapped sideways, casting wild, jumping shadows against the chalk walls, and for a heartbeat the entire dugout groaned, the timber supports creaking in protest as the earth outside rearranged itself. Dust drifted down from the ceiling, settling on Julian's shoulders like snow, but the lieutenant did not flinch. He simply waited for the vibration to pass, his eyes fixed on the torn paper, his hands remaining still on the table. "Close call," Julian murmured, more to the table than to Arthur. That was a 6-inch, probably aimed at the cookhouse. Pity, I rather liked their stew. Arthur pushed through the flap and into the night, the sudden rush of cold air hitting his face like a physical blow. The trench outside seemed louder now, the wind whipping through the wire with a high, keening shriek that sounded nothing like a violin and everything like a woman screaming. He leaned against the parapet, gasping, the fresh paper crumpled in his grip. The crater where his first letter had died was still there, a dark mouth swallowing the shadows, but something had changed. The edge of the trench, the very corner where Bertie had been standing only minutes before, had slumped inward, the sandbags torn open, the woven wattle shattered. Bertie was gone from that spot. Arthur scanned the fire step, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, until he saw the corporal 10 yards down, checking the sling on his rifle, alive and whole, shouting something to Socks about a missing boot. Relief washed over him, cold and sickly, followed immediately by a sharper, colder dread. If the shell had landed 6 feet to the left, Bertie would be paced. If it had landed 6 feet to the right, Arthur would be standing in a hole instead of leaning against a wall. He looked down at the fresh sheet of paper in his hand, blank and pristine, waiting for words that suddenly felt insufficient, trivial, a pathetic attempt to impose order on a universe that operated on the logic of random slaughter. He pulled his pencil from his tunic, the wood rough under his thumb, and pressed the tip to the paper. "Dearest Mother," he wrote, the letters jagged and hurried. "The weather remains dry, though the dust is considerable." He stopped. The lie tasted like ash. Behind him, the canvas flap of the dugout rustled, and Sergeant Major Evans emerged, a clipboard tucked under his arm, his face a mask of impassive granite. He walked past Arthur without a glance, stopping at the junction where the communication trench met the front line. From his pocket, he produced a pin and a single sheet of typed paper, the nightly roster. He pressed the pin into the wood of a support post, the action sharp and final, then stepped back to inspect his work. The paper fluttered in the wind, listing names and times and duties, a bureaucratic anchor in a sea of chaos. Evans signed the bottom corner with a fountain pen he must have kept warm in his inner pocket, the signature a jagged, aggressive scratch that looked like a wound on the page. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the reserve line without a word, leaving the roster to flap and snap in the wind, a silent order that demanded obedience from men who might not be there to answer it in the morning. Arthur watched him go, then looked back at his letter. The pencil hovered over the next line, the lead trembling slightly. He thought of Julian's steady hands, of Bertie's notebook, of Socks's stolen beef, and of the boots in no man's land pointing at a sky that didn't care. He wrote one more sentence, the graphite digging deep into the fiber. "We are all very well." He folded the paper, shoved it into his pocket alongside the bully beef, and turned towards the fire step. The wind howled, tearing at his tunic, whispering through the wire, singing a song that had no sheet music, no end, and no mercy. Dust, thick, choking, alkaline dust that coated the tongue and turned saliva into grit. Arthur spat a grey wad onto the trench floor, watching it vanish into the sludge that passed for footing in Sector 4. The post corporal stood 3 paces away, a canvas sack slung over his shoulder like a dead weight, his face smeared with the same chalky powder that lined the dugout walls. He did not speak. Men rarely spoke when the post arrived. The silence was a superstition, as if acknowledging the letters might summon the German observers currently tethered to their balloons 2 miles east, watching every movement through high-powered lenses. "Vance," the corporal said, his voice cracking from disuse. He thrust a hand into the sack, fingers scrabbling against oilskin and twine, before producing a bundle of envelopes bound with a rubber band that had long since lost its elasticity. Arthur reached out, his fingers stiff from the cold that seeped up through the soles of his boots regardless of the dry summer air. He took the bundle. It felt light, deceptively so. 3 letters from Elsie, their paper thin and brittle, smelling of lavender water and the coal smoke of Camden Town. 1 official circular from the War Office, printed on stiff card that refused to fold. And his own outgoing mail, returned for censorship before dispatch. He sat on an overturned ammunition crate, the wood rough against his thighs, and began to sort. Elsie's letters went into his inner tunic pocket, closest to the heart, a reflex he didn't question. The circular went into the mud. He would read it later, when the boredom became a physical pain greater than the fear. Then he held his own letter to Elsie, the one he had spent 2 evenings drafting by the flicker of a tallow candle, detailing the true state of their water supply. A shadow fell across his lap. The censor, a lieutenant from another company whose name Arthur never learned, and whose face was perpetually obscured by the brim of a cap pulled too low, stepped into the narrow space. He held a thick black pencil, the wood chewed at the end, the lead soft and greasy. "Regulations, Private," the censor said, not looking at Arthur's face but at the paper in his hands. "Section 4, Morale." Arthur held the letter steady. He had written 3 paragraphs about the water, how the tanks arrived lukewarm and tasting of petrol, how the men were boiling water with chloride of lime until their gums bled, and how some, desperate and mad with thirst, were drinking from the shell craters in no man's land despite the orders. Truthful things, necessary things, perhaps, if anyone in Blighty actually read beyond the headlines. The censor leaned in. The smell of stale tobacco and cheap ink rolled off him, cloying and sweet. He drew a single, heavy line through the first paragraph. The black graphite smeared across the blue ink of Arthur's script, obliterating the description of the ration queues. He moved to the second paragraph, the one about the dysentery spreading through the platoon, and scrubbed the pencil back and forth until the paper tore, leaving a jagged hole where the words had been. The third paragraph, detailing the plea for more frequent deliveries, vanished under a thick, angry blot of black. "There," the censor said, snapping the pencil lead with a sharp click, "safe for home consumption." Arthur looked at the page. The black marks looked like wounds, deep and cauterized. The letter now consisted of a greeting, a description of the weather that was a lie, a reassurance of his health that was a half-truth, and a sign-off. The reality of the trench, the thirst that clawed at the throat like a living thing, had been excised with surgical precision. "Cheers," Arthur said, his voice flat. The censor nodded, already turning away, his attention caught by a runner further down the line who was struggling with a box of Mills bombs. The bureaucracy of survival moved on, indifferent to the thirst that remained. Arthur folded the mutilated letter. He would send it. Elsie would read the black bars and know what lay beneath them. She was clever enough to read the silence between the lines. But the act of sending it felt like a betrayal, a complicity in the great, grinding machine that turned truth into propaganda and men into statistics. A sharp crack echoed from the parapet, distinct from the distant thud of artillery. Arthur flinched, his hand instinctively going to his helmet. A chip of brick flew from the communication trench entrance, striking the wall beside his knee with a sound like a pebble thrown against a window pane. Dust puffed out from the impact point, swirling in the stagnant air. "Sniper," someone muttered from the fire step. "Bastards got the sun behind him." Arthur pressed himself flat against the chalk wall, his breath held tight in his chest. The trench seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as the invisible eye of the German rifleman scanned the zigzag line. Seconds stretched, thin and brittle. Then, a scrambling sound, the scrape of boots on loose earth, and a figure tumbled into the shelter of the communication trench, sliding down the slope in a cloud of chalk dust. It was Socks Miller. The runner hit the bottom of the trench with a grunt, rolling onto his back before scrambling up again, his face pale beneath the grime. He pressed his back against the wall next to Arthur, chest heaving, his eyes wide and fixed on the slit in the sandbags where the bullet had entered. "Cut it fine, didn't you, Socks?" Arthur whispered, the adrenaline making his hands tremble slightly. Socks grinned, a jagged expression that didn't reach his eyes. He tapped the side of his head, right where the brick had shattered. Whistled past the ear, that one, felt the wind of it, like a lover's kiss, if your lover was a Prussian bastard with a Mauser. He reached into his tunic, ignoring the dust settling on his hair, and pulled out a small, grease-stained parcel wrapped in brown paper. He thrust it towards Arthur. "Post for you, Titch, special delivery, from the officers' mess, via a detour through the cookhouse and a brief stopover in my pocket." Arthur took the parcel. It was warm from Socks's body heat. He could feel the shape of a tin inside, rectangular and heavy. "You stole it," Arthur said, keeping his voice low. "That's a field punishment, Socks, though it could be something far worse if Evans catches you." "Found it," Socks corrected, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Lying about, lonely, needed a home. Besides, Evans is up at Battalion HQ arguing about latrine positions. He won't be back till dusk." Socks leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And I reckon you need it more than the lieutenant. You look like you've been chewing gravel for breakfast." Arthur unwrapped the paper. Inside was a tin of bully beef, the label peeling, and a small packet of tobacco, the kind with the sweet, aromatic scent that reminded him of his father's study in Bloomsbury a lifetime ago. The theft was brazen, dangerous, and utterly essential. The friction of duty warred with the hunger in his gut, but the hunger won, as it always did. "Thanks," Arthur said, pocketing the tobacco. He would save the beef for later, when the night grew cold and the shadows lengthened. Socks nodded, already pulling his rifle from his shoulder to check the chamber, his movements brisk and practiced. He began to hum a tuneless music hall song, something about a girl in Chelsea refusing to acknowledge the bullet that had nearly taken his ear off minutes before. The normalcy of it, the refusal to tremble, was more terrifying than the sniper. Arthur turned back to his journal, the blacked-out letter tucked away. He needed to write something true, if only for himself. He uncapped his fountain pen, the ink dark and fluid, and began to write by the light of a shielded candle that Bertie had managed to secure from somewhere. "The beef tastes rich with guilt," he wrote, the nib scratching against the rough paper. "Socks hums as if the world hasn't ended. Perhaps that is the only way to survive it." He paused, the pen hovering. From his pocket, he pulled the last piece of mail he had received, the one from Julian Thorne. He had saved it for last, dreading what he might find. The envelope was crumpled, stained with mud that looked suspiciously like the clay from the front line rather than the rear echelon. He slit the envelope with his thumbnail and pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. Julian's handwriting, usually a model of officer-class elegance, was jagged, the loops broken, the ink splattered. There was no greeting, no inquiry after health or family, just a single sentence written in the center of the page, the letters trembling as if the hand that held the pen had been shaking violently. "The wire is singing again, Arthur, and I cannot find the sheet music to make it stop." Below the sentence, a smudge of dark mud marred the white paper, a fingerprint pressed hard into the fiber, as if Julian had leaned his weight against the page in a moment of exhaustion or despair. Arthur stared at the words, the wire, the barbed wire in no man's land, singing. He looked up towards the parapet, where the wind was beginning to rise, whipping through the twisted metal coils that separated the living from the dead. A low, keening sound drifted in from the darkness, a high-pitched vibration that set his teeth on edge, a sound that was not quite wind, not quite machine, but something else entirely. Something human. Arthur folded the letter slowly, his fingers numb, and tucked it into his tunic pocket, next to the lavender-scented notes from Elsie. The candle flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the chalk walls, and for the first time that day, the silence of the trench felt heavy, not with absence, but with a presence that was waiting, just beyond the wire, for the music to begin. The black pencil hovered, a thick stick of graphite poised like a dagger over the page. Arthur held his breath, watching the tip descend. It was not a gentle instrument. The post-corporal, a man whose face seemed carved from the same grey tallow as the trench walls, pressed down hard. 3 paragraphs vanished under a stroke so heavy the paper buckled, the fibers tearing slightly where the leads snapped against the force of the censorship. "Gone," the corporal muttered, not looking up. "Regulations, Vance. Can't have the folks in Bloomsbury thinking we're dying of thirst along with the rest of it." Arthur nodded, though the motion felt stiff, mechanical. He took the letter back, the ink still wet beneath the brutal black bars that now strangled his words to Elsie. He had written about the water carts failing to arrive, about the tongues swelling in mouths until speech became a labor, about the way the mud tasted of salt and rust when the rain came. Now those truths were sealed away, buried under a lie of omission that would travel 200 miles to a quiet house in Camden Town. His mother would read the remaining lines about the weather and the football scores, and she would sleep soundly, believing her son was merely cold, not parched. Next, the corporal said, extending a hand already stained with soot and ink. Arthur stepped aside, clutching the defiled envelope. The trench felt narrower suddenly, the walls closing in as if the earth itself sought to compress the silence he was forced to keep. He moved along the fire step, boots squelching in the slurry that coated the floor, a mixture of chalk dust, clay, and things better left unnamed. The air hung thick with the smell of wet wool and the acrid tang of cordite that never quite dissipated, clinging to the back of the throat like a bad memory. A sharp crack split the air, distinct from the distant rumble of the heavies. It was the sound of a high-velocity round striking brick, close enough to spray shards of red clay across Arthur's tunic. He flinched, dropping to a crouch instinctively, his shoulder jamming against the wattle revetment. Dust plumed from the corner of the communication trench, a small cloud of pulverized mortar swirling in the draft. "Bit lively today, isn't it?" The voice came from below, breathless and cheerful. Socks Miller scrambled up the slope of Socks Run, his movements fluid despite the steep, slippery incline. He slid the last few feet, landing with a wet slap beside Arthur, his cap askew and a grin splitting his dirty face. A fresh gouge marked the brickwork just above where Socks's head had been seconds before, the edges still smoking faintly. "You're mad, Miller," Arthur hissed, grabbing the runner's arm to steady him, "for that sniper has the range pinned. One more inch and you'd be feeding the worms without your hat." Socks brushed the dust from his shoulder, unfazed, insisting that the man simply had poor eyesight and likely mistook him for a rat. Besides, he had a delivery to make. He patted his tunic pocket, where the fabric bulged with a rectangular shape, calling it a special requisition direct from the officer's pantry that had taken a shortcut through the cookhouse and a brief detour through his own personal inventory. Arthur stared at him, the racing of his heart fading into a dull ache behind his eyes. "You stole it." "Borrowed," Socks corrected, pulling out a grease-stained parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Found it lying about, lonely, needed a proper home." He thrust the package towards Arthur, his eyes darting towards the parapet before returning to his friend. "And I reckon you need it more than Lieutenant Thorne. Man's living on tea and nerves lately. Saw him staring at a map for an hour this morning, talking to a teacup." Arthur took the parcel. It was warm, radiating the heat of Socks's body, a stark contrast to the chilled dampness of the trench. He could feel the weight of it, solid and reassuring. Inside, he knew, would be a tin of bully beef and perhaps a packet of tobacco, treasures more valuable than gold in this shattered landscape. "Evans will have your hide if he finds out," Arthur said, though his fingers were already picking at the string. "Field punishment number 1, or worse." "Evans is up at Battalion HQ, Socks whispered, leaning in close enough for Arthur to smell the stale tobacco on his breath. "Arguing about latrine allocations with the Major. Won't be back until dusk gives him an excuse to stop shouting." He straightened up, checking the bolt on his rifle with practiced ease. "Eat up, Titch, before the guilt sets in." Arthur unwrapped the paper. The tin of beef gleamed dully in the dim light, the label peeling to reveal the metal beneath. Beside it lay a small packet of Player's Navy Cut, the scent of the tobacco drifting up, sweet and aromatic, a ghost of a world that existed before the mud and the wire. It smelled of his father's study, of leather armchairs and quiet evenings, a lifetime ago. The friction between the duty he owed the king and the hunger gnawing at his gut resolved itself instantly. Hunger won. It always did. "Cheers, Socks," Arthur murmured, pocketing the tobacco. "I'll save the beef for tonight." Socks nodded, already turning away, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He began to hum a tune, a jaunty, off-key music hall ditty about a girl in Chelsea who lost her shoe. The melody drifted through the trench, absurd and bright against the backdrop of decay, refusing to acknowledge the bullet that had chipped the brickwork inches from his ear. The normalcy of it terrified Arthur more than the sniper ever could. It suggested a world where songs still mattered, where bullets were merely interruptions rather than endings. Arthur retreated to the corner of the dugout, shielding the candle flame Bertie had scavenged earlier. The light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and twisted against the chalk walls like restless spirits. He opened his journal, the pages rough and stained, and dipped his pen. The ink flowed dark and thick, a stark contrast to the grey monotony of his surroundings. "The beef tastes rich with guilt," he wrote, the nib scratching softly against the paper. "Socks hums as if the world has not ended. Perhaps that is the only way to endure it, to sing while the earth opens beneath your feet." He paused, the pen hovering above the page. The silence of the trench pressed in, heavy and expectant. From his pocket, he withdrew the final piece of mail, the envelope crumpled and stained with mud that looked too dark, too wet, to have come from the rear echelons. It bore Julian's handwriting, but the loops were jagged, the letters trembling as if written by a hand that could no longer command the fingers. Arthur slit the envelope with his thumbnail, the paper resisting slightly before giving way. Inside was a single sheet, folded haphazardly. There was no date, no greeting, no inquiry after health or kin, just a sentence scrawled in the center of the page, the ink splattered as though the writer had been shaking violently. "The wire is singing again, Arthur, a dreadful violin concerto in the rain, and I cannot find the sheet music to make it stop." Below the words, a smudge of dark clay marred the white paper, a fingerprint driven deep into the fiber, as if Julian had pressed his entire weight against the page in a moment of desperate exhaustion. Arthur traced the mark with his thumb, feeling the rough texture of the dried mud. It was the same clay from the front line, the same soil that swallowed boots and men alike. He looked up towards the parapet where the wind was beginning to rise. A low, keening sound drifted in from the darkness, a high-pitched vibration that set his teeth on edge. It was not the wind. It was not the machinery of war. It was something else, something human and broken, caught in the twisted coils of barbed wire that separated the living from the dead. Arthur folded the letter slowly, his fingers numb, and tucked it into his tunic beside the lavender-scented notes from Elsie. The candle flame guttered, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach for him, and for the first time that day, the silence of the trench felt not like an absence, but like a presence waiting just beyond the wire for the music to begin. "Borrowed," Socks corrected the record with a sharp jerk of his chin, pulling a grease-stained parcel from the deep pocket of his tunic. "Found it lying about, lonely, needed a proper home." He thrust the package towards Arthur, eyes darting towards the parapet before snapping back to his friend's face. "And I reckon you need it more than Lieutenant Thorne. Man's living on tea and nerves lately. Saw him staring at a map for an hour this morning, talking to a teacup." Arthur took the parcel. It radiated heat, a stark contrast to the chill dampness seeping through the dugout walls. Inside, a tin of bully beef and a packet of tobacco rested against each other, treasures more valuable than gold in this shattered landscape. "Evans will have your hide if he finds out," Arthur said, even as his fingers were already picking at the string. "Field punishment number 1, or worse." "Evans is up at Battalion HQ, Socks whispered, leaning in close enough for Arthur to smell the stale tobacco on his breath. "Arguing about latrine allocations with the Major. Won't be back until dusk gives him an excuse to stop shouting." He straightened up, checking the bolt on his rifle with practiced ease. "Eat up, Titch, before the guilt sets in." Socks nodded, already turning away, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He began to hum a tune, a jaunty, off-key music hall ditty about a girl in Chelsea who lost her shoe. The melody drifted through the trench, absurd and bright against the backdrop of decay, refusing to acknowledge the bullet that had chipped the brickwork inches from his ear moments before. The normalcy of it terrified Arthur more than the sniper ever could. It suggested a world where songs still mattered, where bullets were merely interruptions rather than endings. Arthur waited until the humming faded into the general murmur of the line before retreating to the corner of the dugout. He shielded the candle flame Bertie had scavenged earlier, cupping his hands around the fragile light. The wax sputtered, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and twisted against the chalk walls like restless spirits. He opened his journal, the pages rough and stained, and dipped his pen. The ink flowed dark and thick, a stark contrast to the grey monotony of his surroundings. "The beef tastes rich with guilt," he wrote, the nib scratching softly against the paper. "Socks hums as if the world has not ended. Perhaps that is the only way to endure it, to sing while the earth opens beneath your feet." He paused, the pen hovering above the page. The trench settled around him, heavy and expectant. From his pocket, he withdrew the final piece of mail, the envelope crumpled and stained with mud that looked too dark, too wet, to have come from the rear echelons. It bore Julian's handwriting, but the loops were jagged, the letters trembling as if written by a hand that could no longer command the fingers. Arthur slit the envelope with his thumbnail, the paper resisting slightly before giving way. Inside was a single sheet, folded haphazardly. There was no date, no greeting, no inquiry after health or kin, just a sentence scrawled in the center of the page, the ink splattered as though the writer had been shaking violently. "The wire is singing again, Arthur, a dreadful violin concerto in the rain, and I cannot find the sheet music to make it stop." Below the words, a smudge of dark clay marred the white paper, a fingerprint driven deep into the fiber, as if Julian had pressed his entire weight against the page in a moment of desperate exhaustion. Arthur traced the mark with his thumb, feeling the rough texture of the dried mud. It was the same clay from the front line, the same soil that swallowed boots and men alike. He looked up towards the parapet where the wind was beginning to rise. A low, keening sound drifted in from the darkness, a high-pitched whine that set his nerves on edge. It was not the wind. It was not the machinery of war. It was something else, something human and broken, caught in the twisted coils of barbed wire that separated the living from the dead. Arthur folded the letter slowly, his fingers numb, and tucked it into his tunic beside the lavender-scented notes from Elsie. The candle flame guttered, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach for him, and for the first time that day, the quiet of the trench felt not like an absence, but like a presence waiting just beyond the wire for the music to begin. The pen refused to sit still. It skittered across the page, a drunken insect leaving a trail of black devastation rather than the crisp, authoritative loops expected of an officer and a gentleman. Julian Thorne gripped the fountain pen until his knuckles turned the color of old bone, forcing the nib down hard enough to tear the fiber of the map sheet beneath. A jagged rip appeared, splitting the contour lines of Thiepval Ridge right through the sector marked for the next push. He stared at the tear. It looked like a wound, fresh, bleeding ink instead of blood. "Steady," he whispered, the word cracking in his dry throat. "Steady as she goes, Julian, for Arthur's sake." He tried again. This time he aimed for the signature of Major Halloway, the company commander whose health was currently being preserved in a hospital bed in Etaples, far from the screaming earth of the Somme. The fitness report lay open on the rough-hewn table, a document of life and death disguised as bureaucratic routine. Fit for active service, it needed to say. Mental faculties unimpaired. If the medical officer saw the tremor in Julian's hand, if he noticed the way the lieutenant's eyes darted to the dugout entrance every time a distant thump vibrated through the chalk, Julian would be sent down, packaged up like damaged goods, sent to Blighty, and Arthur would be left alone in the mud with socks and Bertie and the endless, grinding noise. The candle guttered, sending a plume of acrid smoke curling towards the low, arched ceiling of the former German wine cellar. The air smelled of damp wool, stale tobacco, and the metallic tang of the field telephone that sat silent on the corner of the desk, a black monolith waiting to ring with orders that made no sense. Julian dipped the pen again, the inkwell trembling slightly as his elbow knocked against it. He began to write, not the report, but the letter, the real one, the one that mattered. "My dear Tidge, you asked in your last post if the nights were getting shorter. Here, time has lost its measurement. We do not count hours, we count the intervals between the whistling, and tonight the interval is gone." His handwriting slanted sharply to the right, the letters elongating as if trying to escape the page. He pressed harder, desperate to impose order on the chaos inside his skull. "The wire is singing again, Arthur. A dreadful violin concerto in the rain, high E screaming until the varnish peels. I have searched the dugout, turned out every pocket, rifled through the maps until my fingers bleed, but I cannot find the sheet music to make them stop playing. They demand a conductor. They demand I raise the baton and lead them into the crescendo, but my Hansa look at my hands, Titch. They are not mine anymore." A shell landed somewhere close, not a direct hit, but near enough to send a cascade of fine chalk dust filtering down from the ceiling, settling on the map, on the fitness report, on Julian's hair like grey snow. He did not flinch. He simply watched the dust settle, mesmerized by the way it coated the black ink, turning the words gray and ghostly. The vibration traveled up through the soles of his boots, into his shins, humming in his teeth, a low frequency that resonated in the hollow spaces of his chest. They say it is the wind catching the strands, he wrote, the pen moving faster now, the ink pooling in thick, wet blobs where he paused too long. But wind does not scream in F-sharp. Wind does not beg. I hear them titch, the boys from the first day. They are caught in the coils, tangled up like flies in a spider's web, and the bow is drawn across their strings. Over and over, a relentless adagio. He stopped, the pen hovered, a drop of ink swelling at the nib, threatening to fall. He could hear Evans outside, the sergeant major's voice booming in the communication trench, barking orders about latrine allocations and ration counts. The sound was sharp, real, anchored in the mundane brutality of army life. It was a lifeline. Julian grabbed at it. Ignore me, he scrawled, the letters degrading into jagged, childish scratches born of fatigue and damp, nothing more. He would sign the papers and lead the platoon, so she must not worry Elsie. Tell her the weather in Bloomsbury is likely splendid this autumn, that the leaves on the square are turning a proper golden brown, while pigeons still fight over crumbs near the fountain. Tell her he remembers the taste of those ices bought near the British Museum, the ones that melted too fast in the summer heat. Do you remember? The sticky sweetness on our chins meant we were so clean then. Another vibration, closer this time. The candle flame dipped violently, casting long, frantic shadows that danced across the chalk walls, mimicking the movement of men running, falling, rising again. Julian's hand spasmed. The pen slipped. A thick, dark line slashed across the page, ruining the word clean, obliterating it under a smear of indelible black. No, he hissed, slamming his palm down on the table. No, no, no. He tried to lift the pen, to salvage the sentence, to explain that the dirt was only on the surface, that underneath he was still the man who walked on pavement, who bought ices, who understood the rules of grammar and conduct. But the shaking had spread to his arm, a violent tremor that rattled the inkwell, sending a small pool of black fluid spreading across the map, drowning the contour lines of the ridge, swallowing the sector markers. The music is too loud, Titch. It drowns out the thought. I try to focus on the signature, on the loop of the H, but the violins rise up and they are so angry. They know I am forging the report. They know I am lying to the doctor. They know I am staying because if I leave, who will watch your back? Who will tell Socks to stop stealing the officer's jam? Who will remind Bertie that the mud is only earth trying to hug us? The pen scratched wildly now, the nib tearing through the paper to create a ragged hole where the word hug had been. Julian's breath came in short, sharp gasps, the air feeling too thin, too crowded with the smell of cordite and wet dog. He could hear the wire singing, a high, piercing note that definitely drilled into his temple. He needed to stop it. He needed to find the sheet music, which had to be here somewhere. Was it in the drawer, or perhaps under the map? If I can just find the rest of the score, I can conduct them. I can make them resolve, a perfect cadence. Then we can sleep. Then we can go home to Camden and you can show me the new books you bought and we can pretend that none of this ever happened. Elsie will play the piano. She plays Chopin so well, don't you think? Much better than me. I never could get the left hand to keep time with the right. Always rushing ahead. Always rushinger. A massive impact shook the dugout, far heavier than the previous shelling. The ceiling groaned, a sound of tearing wood and shifting earth. A crack appeared in the chalk wall, snaking its way down towards the table. Dust billowed in a thick cloud, choking the light. Julian jerked upright, his eyes wide, staring at the crack as if it were a mouth opening to speak. The pen fell from his fingers, rolling across the table, leaving a final, erratic trail of ink that ran off the edge of the paper and onto the wood. He reached for it, his fingers brushing the barrel, but the vibration returned, stronger this time, a physical blow that knocked the breath from his lungs. The candle tipped over, wax spilling onto the fitness report, sealing the forged signature under a hard white tomb. Julian's hand hovered in the air, trembling violently, unable to grasp the pen, unable to stop the music that was now roaring in his ears, drowning out the sound of the earth collapsing around him. The pen lay on the floor, inches from his boot, the nib bent and broken. The ink continued to flow from the fractured reservoir, a slow, dark pulse spreading across the dusty floorboards, merging with the chalk dust, creating a shape that looked nothing like words, nothing like music, nothing like the clean, golden streets of Bloomsbury. It was just a stain, growing, darker, deeper. Waiting for someone to come and wipe it away before the major returned to find his lieutenant conducting an orchestra of ghosts in the dark. Arthur ducked, shoulders hunching instinctively as the trench floor jumped beneath his knees, a violent shudder that knocked the breath from his lungs and sent a cascade of loose clay sliding from the parapet into his collar. He pressed his spine against the wet sandbags, the rough Hessians scratching his neck, and clutched the envelope against his chest, as if the paper could shield him from the concussion rolling overhead. Another whistle, sharp and tearing, followed by the dull thump of impact somewhere near the support line, vibrating through the soles of his boots like a heavy door slamming shut in a distant house. "Keep your head down, Titch," Bertie Higgs muttered, voice low and rough, barely audible over the settling debris. "No point giving the Boche a free ticket home by sticking your nose up for a bit of post." Arthur nodded, though Bertie couldn't see it in the gloom. He waited for the echo of the explosion to fade, replaced by the ringing in his ears and the heavy, wet sound of breathing from the men crouched along the fire step. The air tasted of burnt powder and damp wool, a familiar cocktail that coated the throat and refused to wash away. He pulled the envelope from his tunic pocket, the paper damp and soft, edges frayed from the journey through the communication trenches. It bore Julian's handwriting, but the loops were wrong, jagged where they should have been smooth, the ink blotched in places as if the pen had stuttered across the page. He struck a match, cupping his hand around the flame to shield it from the draft that whistled through the zigzag. The light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the clay face of the trench, illuminating the mud caked on his puttees and the dark stain already spreading on his thigh where his own fountain pen had leaked during the first jolt. He hadn't even uncapped it. The vibration alone had forced the ink from the nib, a slow, dark seep into the khaki fabric that looked uncomfortably like a wound. "Bad one?" Bertie asked, shifting his weight. The corporal's rifle rested against his knee, barrel clean, ready. "Julian," Arthur said, unfolding the sheet. "He's writing nonsense. Officers do that, keeps them warm." "It's not warmth, Bertie, it's a fever." Arthur scanned the lines, his eyes catching on the references to violins and sheet music, the desperate pleas about the wire singing. The words swam before him, disjointed and urgent, lacking the precise grammar Julian had prided himself on since their days at the university. "The music is too loud, Titch." Arthur traced the sentence with a muddy thumb, feeling the groove where the nib had torn through the paper. A hole. Julian had pressed too hard. "Read us a bit," Bertie said, leaning in slightly. "Maybe he's ordered us some extra rum." "He says the boys are caught in the coils," Arthur said, voice flat, "like flies." Bertie spat into the mud, declaring that flies don't last long in coils. "Neither do we, best not think on it." "I can't help it." "Then don't." Bertie reached out, calloused fingers brushing Arthur's sleeve, stopping just short of the ink stain. "You read that lot, you'll be joining him in the loony bin before the week's out. Save the worry for the ration count." Arthur folded the paper quickly, tucking it back into his pocket alongside his own pen, the metal cold against his hip. The match burned down to his fingers, heat biting the skin, and he dropped it into the sludge where it hissed and died. The darkness rushed back in, heavier than before, pressing against his eyes. He could feel the ink soaking through his trousers, cooling against the skin of his leg, a persistent reminder of the fragility of things. Pens broke, paper tore, men fractured. "Light's gone," Bertie noted, shifting his rifle to a more comfortable angle. "Save the matches. Evans'll have our guts for garters if he sees a glow from the line." "Evans doesn't care about glows. He cares about latrines." "Same thing, really. Smells identical." Arthur managed a thin smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. He shifted his legs, trying to find a position that didn't press the wet patch against his skin, but the mud found every gap, every seam, seeping through like water through a sieve. He thought of Julian in the dugout, perhaps still holding that broken pen, staring at a wall that wasn't there. The distance between them was only 200 yards, yet it felt like miles, separated by rank and duty and the thick, suffocating fog of command that kept officers isolated in their chalk cells while privates rotted in the clay. "He needs rest," Arthur said, more to himself than Bertie. Who, the lieutenant? Bertie chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He'll rest when we're in Blighty, or when he's dead, no in between. I could send a message. Through who? Socks, Bertie snorted. Miller's likely halfway to Berlin by now, selling the Major's cigars to the French. You send him, you'll get a reply next Christmas. Socks always gets through. Socks gets through because he runs like the devil's chasing him with a pitchfork, not because he's reliable. Arthur leaned his head back against the sandbags, closing his eyes. The shelling had eased to a sporadic rhythm, single rounds landing with irregular thuds that kept the nerves raw, preventing any true relaxation. He could feel the ink on his leg drying, stiffening the fabric, a permanent mark of this minute, this moment of reading while the world tried to shake itself apart. He needed to write back. He needed to tell Julian to stop, to sleep, to put the pen down. But words on paper felt useless against the noise Julian described, a feeble attempt to shout down an orchestra of ghosts. Write him a letter tomorrow, Bertie said, sensing the tension in Arthur's shoulders. Tell him the weather's fine. Tell him the king's sending a medal. He knows I'm lying. Everyone knows everyone's lying, Titch. That's the game. We lie to them, they lie to us, and the Germans lie to all of us by trying to blow us up. It's diplomacy. Arthur opened his eyes, staring up at the narrow strip of sky visible above the trench lip. It was grey, colourless, matching the mud and the wool and the exhaustion in his bones. No stars, no moon, just the endless, churning cloud cover that trapped the smoke and the smell of death close to the ground. He touched his pocket, feeling the crumpled paper through the fabric. I'm writing tonight, Arthur said. You'll need light. I'll find it. You'll get shot. Better than going mad. Bertie sighed, a long exhalation that misted in the cold air. He shifted his rifle again, the wood creaking softly. Suit yourself. Just don't blame me when Evans catches you scribbling instead of watching the wire. I'll tell him you were counting bullets. Tell him I was counting the dead. Don't start that. Arthur fell silent, listening to the wind moving through the barbed wire ahead, a low, mournful sound that might have been singing if one listened too closely. He wouldn't listen. He would write. He would tell Julian about the weather in Bloomsbury, about the leaves turning gold, about the pigeons fighting over crumbs. He would lie. He would weave a net of false normalcy and throw it over his friend, hoping it might hold for one more night. But first, he had to clean the ink from his trousers, scrub the stain away before it set, before it became part of the uniform, part of the man. He reached for his water bottle, uncapping it with stiff fingers. The liquid sloshed inside, cold and precious. He poured a little onto the stain, watching the dark color dilute, spread, fade slightly but never disappear. Some things marked you for keeps. He rubbed the fabric with his thumb, rough skin against wet wool, until the cold seeped through to his leg. Stop fussing, Bertie said. It's only mud and ink, washes out in the grave. Arthur capped the bottle. He looked towards the rear of the trench, where the communication line led back to the battalion headquarters, to the dugout where Julian sat alone with his broken pen and his singing wire. The path was dark, exposed to snipers until the cover of true night fell. He would have to wait. He would have to sit in the dark and let the ink dry on his skin, let the cold settle into his marrow, and wait for the moment when the risk of moving was less than the risk of staying silent. Pass the paper, Arthur said. Bertie hesitated, then reached into his own tunic, pulling out a small, grease-stained notebook. He tore out a blank page, the sound sharp in the quiet interval between shells. Don't say I never gave you anything. Arthur took the paper. It felt thin, fragile, easily torn, like everything else here. He uncapped his pen, checking the nib, ensuring the ink flowed. It did. A steady, dark line. He balanced the paper on his knee, the mud soaking through instantly, and prepared to write the lie that might save a life. Make it good, Bertie whispered, turning his eyes back to the parapet. Make it sound like home. Arthur touched the nib to the page. The ink flowed. The trench held its breath. The pen stopped. The ink pooled at the end of the hyphen, a dark, swollen tear that grew heavy and then spilled over, running down the grain of the paper in a jagged black river. It crossed the word thinking, obliterating it, drowning the thought before it could be born. The hand that held the pen twitched. a spasm that traveled up the wrist and locked the elbow, freezing the limb in midair. Julian Thorne did not drop the pen. He could not. His fingers were clamped around the barrel, white-knuckled and rigid, as if releasing it would release the last tether holding him to the chair, to the dugout, to the earth itself. He stared at the blotch. It pulsed. It looked like a wound, a fresh, wet wound in the side of the page, bleeding ink onto the map beneath. The map. He shifted his gaze, the movement jerky, mechanical. The back of the German map lay spread on the table, the grid lines faint under the flickering candlelight. He had been practicing for an hour, maybe two. Time had lost its shape, melting into the same grey sludge that coated the trench walls outside. Major H.G. Evans. He wrote it again, the loop of the H too tight, a strangled thing, while the V in Evans dipped too low, dragging the tail of the letter into the paper fiber until it tore. A small rip emerged that was barely visible. Yet it was there, a flaw in the signature, a crack in the mask. "Damn you," Julian whispered, the voice not his own but thin and reedy, a stranger's echo rebounding through a cavern. "Damn you to hell." He pressed harder, the nib dug into the paper, scratching a groove that would remain long after the ink faded. Major H.G. Evans, the letters danced. They stepped out of line, marching in a drunken stagger across the page, fit for duty. That was the phrase that mattered. The phrase that kept him here in the chalk cellar with the singing wire and the missing sheet music. If he could just sign the report. If he could just forge the company commander's name on the fitness certificate, the medical officer would never know. The M.O. was a busy man, a man who looked at eyes but did not see the tremor in the hand that held the eyelid open. Fit for duty. The paper tore again, a long, ragged split this time, running from the signature down through the grid lines of Sector 4. Julian stared at the tear. It looked like a trench, a communication trench, deep and muddy, cutting through the heart of the map. He could almost smell the wet wool and the cordite rising from the rip. A shell landed nearby, not a direct hit, a near miss. The concussion hit the dugout like a physical blow, knocking the candle from the table. The flame died instantly, plunging the room into darkness. Julian did not move, sitting in the blackness with the pen still clutched in his frozen hand and the torn map under his other palm. Dust from the ceiling sifted down to settle on his hair, his shoulders, the back of his neck. It tasted of chalk and old death. He could hear his own breathing, loud and ragged in the silence that followed the blast. No, not silence. The singing had stopped, the violins were mute, but the wire was still there. He could feel it humming in the dark, vibrating through the table, through his arms, into his chest. Thinking over. What was he thinking of? The sentence hung in the air, unfinished, a ghost limb of a thought. Peaches, socks, the pigeons in Bloomsbury. He tried to grasp it, to pull the memory back from the fog, but it slipped away, dissolving like the ink on the wet page. "Evans," he said to the dark, "I am fit." No one answered. The darkness pressed in heavy and suffocating. He reached for the matches, his hand shaking so violently that he dropped the box. It skittered across the table, falling to the floor with a soft thud. He cursed, a low, guttural sound, and slid from the chair to his knees, groping in the dirt for the matches. His fingers brushed against something cold and metallic, a cartridge case, empty, discarded. He picked it up, turning it over in his palm. Brass, smooth, cold. He struck a match. The flare of light was blinding, momentarily searing the retina. He saw the torn map, the ruined letter, the ink blot that looked like a bullet hole, and he saw his own reflection in the brass casing, distorted and warped, a face he barely recognized, gaunt, pale, eyes wide and hollow, staring back at him from the bottom of a well. He lit the candle again, and as the flame wavered, it cast long, dancing shadows against the chalk walls that looked like men standing in the corners, watching while they waited for the next movement. Julian picked up the pen and dipped it in the inkwell, where the ink was thick, congealing in the cold. He touched the nib to the paper, to the edge of the tear. He would start again, write the report, and sign the name to prove he was fit. He had to for Arthur. If he went, Arthur would be alone in the mud, alone with the singing wire. Major H.G., a circumflex. The hand spasmed, and the pen jerked so violently that the line shot out across the page, a wild, black scar ruining the margin, the form, everything. Julian stared. breath hitched in his throat. Although he tried to draw the pen back to correct the error, the hand would not obey, for it was no longer his but belonged to the wire, the concerto, the missing sheet music. He dropped the pen, watching it roll across the table to leave a trail of ink behind, a dark path leading nowhere. As he pushed the chair back, its legs scraped harshly against the stone floor. He stood up, though his knees buckled before they locked. He was standing, upright and fit. "Fit," he said to the shadows, "fit for duty." The shadows did not agree. They shifted, closing in. The wire began to sing again, a low, mournful note that rose in pitch, climbing higher and higher until it was a scream. Julian clapped his hands over his ears. It did not help. The sound was inside the bone, inside the blood. He stumbled towards the door, towards the flap that led to the trench, to the mud, to the rain. He needed air. He needed silence. He needed the sheet music. He pushed through the canvas, out into the night. The rain hit his face, cold and stinging. The sky was a churning void, black on black. No stars, no moon, only the flash of artillery on the horizon, lighting up the clouds in brief, sickly pulses. Flash, boom, flash, boom, the rhythm of the concerto. The tempo was accelerating. Julian leaned against the dugout wall, sliding down until he hit the mud. He pulled his knees to his chest, wrapping his arms around them, rocking back and forth. The pen was still in his pocket. He could feel it there, a hard, sharp edge against his thigh. He reached for it, drew it out. He held it up to the flash of the shells, watching the light glint off the nib. Thinking over. The thought returned, clear now and sharp, until he remembered what he was thinking of: the yellow label, the peaches, and Socks Miller. The runner, the thief. Socks would know because Socks always knew where to find things. He found things that were lost, things that were broken. Socks, Julian whispered. The name was snatched away by the wind, carried off towards the lines, towards the wire, towards the German trenches where the orchestra was tuning up for the finale. He uncapped the pen, resolved to write it down, a note to Socks, a requisition for official business that declared him fit for duty. Balancing the paper on his knee, he felt the mud soaking through his trousers, cold and cloying. Then he touched the nib to the page. Dear Socks. Require peaches, yellow label, urgent, the wire isser. A whistle blew, sharp and piercing as it cut through the rain, the noise and the singing. The prelude was over. The movement had begun. Julian looked up as the flare hung in the sky, a magnesium sun that turned the mud to silver and the wire to jagged teeth. He saw the shadows move. They were not shadows but men, climbing out and climbing up over the top. He looked down at his letter. The ink was running again, washed by the rain, blurring the words, erasing the request, the name, the signature. Dear Socks, require peaches. The words dissolved into a grey smear, indistinguishable from the mud on his knees. He tried to stand. His legs would not hold him. The earth grabbed him, pulled him down, hugging him back before the high explosive arrived. He smiled. A terrible, broken smile. He understood now. The sheet music was not missing. It was never written. They were improvising, all of them, until the final note. The pen slipped from his fingers, falling into the mud. It vanished instantly, swallowed by the clay, just like the letter, just like the peaches, just like the man who wrote them. Julian Thorne closed his eyes to listen to the wire, which was singing louder now, like a dreadful violin concerto, and for the first time, he thought he recognized the tune. It was a lullaby. He opened his mouth to hum along, to find the harmony, but the world exploded in white fire, and the music stopped. Back in the front line, Arthur Vance paused, his pen hovering over the blank page Bertie had given him. The ground had jumped, a single violent jerk that knocked the breath from his lungs. He looked at Bertie. Bertie was staring at the rear of the trench, his face pale in the gloom. That was close, Bertie said, too quiet. Arthur looked down at his paper where a drop of rain, or perhaps sweat, had fallen from his brow to land right in the center of the page. It spread, a clear, darkening circle. Ignoring it, he dipped his pen. He had to write the lie, and he had to make it sound like home. Dearest Julian, the weather in Bloomsbury is fine. The leaves are turning gold. The pigeons are fighting over crumbs outside the bakery. Everything is exactly as it should be. He stopped, the pen trembled in his hand. He looked at the ink stain on his trousers, the one that would not wash out. He thought of the dugout, 200 yards away, a lifetime. Except, he wrote, the letters tight and cramped, I find myself wondering if you have had enough rest lately. The music here is quite loud, and I should hate for you to miss a note due to exhaustion. Do try to sleep, old boy, just for an hour. I shall keep watch. He blew on the ink to dry it, folding the paper quickly before the rain could take it too. He tucked it into his tunic, next to his heart. He would send it with Socks. If Socks was still alive, if the wire stopped singing long enough for a runner to pass. Ready? Bertie asked, racking the bolt of his rifle. Arthur nodded, picking up his own rifle where the wood felt cold and the steel even colder. He looked at the parapet, at the wire, at the flashing horizon. Ready, he said. But he wasn't. None of them were. They were just playing by ear, hoping not to hit a wrong note, hoping the roof wouldn't come down, hoping the music would stop before the final movement. The whistle blew again, closer this time. Arthur climbed the steps. The mud sucked at his boots. He did not look back. He couldn't. If he looked back, he might see the dugout collapsing. He might see the ink blot spreading on the map. He might see Julian Thorne dropping the pen. He went over the top. The wire screamed. The violins rose to a crescendo, and the world turned to fire. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The tin helmet hit the trench floor with a wet slap, heavy now, brimming with the grey, cloying sludge that had risen another inch since dawn. It smelled of wet wool gone rotten, of cordite dust, and beneath it all, that sweet, sickly perfume of things left too long in the sun before the rain came to wash them cold. Arthur Vance wiped his brow with a sleeve already stiff with dried mud, leaving a fresh, dark smear across his forehead. His boots felt like blocks of concrete, the clay sucking at the leather with every shift of weight, a greedy mouth that refused to let go. Give over, Titch, Bertie Higgs said, his voice a low rumble that barely rose above the drip, drip, drip of water running down the sandbag walls. You'll wear a hole in the sole before the Boche even gets a look at you. Arthur dropped the helmet. The mud inside rippled, settling slowly. It's everywhere, Bert, in the seams, under the nails. I dreamt last night I was drowning in it, only I couldn't swim because my kit was too heavy. Proper nightmare that, Bertie agreed, leaning back against the revetment. He pulled a small, dented flask from his tunic pocket, the metal warm from his body heat. He unscrewed the cap with a twist of thumb and forefinger, the sound sharp in the damp air. Here, a sip, just to take the chill off the bones. Arthur hesitated, then took the flask. The rum burned going down, a line of fire that cut through the damp cold settling in his chest. He handed it back, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Bertie took a swallow, larger than Arthur's, then capped the flask and tucked it away with careful precision. Half full, Bertie said, patting his left breast pocket where the hard corner of a notebook pressed against the fabric. That's how I see it. Half full of names, mind you, young Miller from the Bedfords, Private Thomas, the lad who sang so off-key in the bathhouse, and old Sergeant Davies, though God knows he had enough names written in the sky already. Arthur watched him, the flicker of the trench candle casting long, dancing shadows that made Bertie's face look older, the lines around his eyes deepened by grime and exhaustion. You still keeping that book, then? Everyone, Bertie said, his gaze fixed on the parapet where a strand of barbed wire glinted dull grey against the gloom. Can't have the War Office sending a form letter to mother in Leeds saying her boy died in the field. Needs more than that. Needs to know he stole an extra ration of jam 2 days prior. Needs to know he laughed at a joke about a mule. Someone has to carry it home, Titch. If I'm the one left standing when the curtain falls, I'll deliver the lot. Personal hand to hand. A shell whined overhead, a distant, tearing sound that grew rapidly into a scream before impacting somewhere behind the line with a muffled thump that shook the ground under their feet. Dirt rained down from the overhead beams, dusting their shoulders with fine, white chalk. Neither man flinched. They just waited for the secondary blast, the shrapnel rain, but the silence returned, heavy and thick. Right, Arthur said, picking up his pen again. The nib was bent slightly, warped from the damp, but it would still scratch out the lies he needed to tell. He balanced his notebook on his knee, the paper slick with moisture. "I'm writing to Elsie. Tell her the weather is turning. Tell her the leaves are gold in Bloomsbury." "And the mud?" Bertie asked, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Arthur paused, the pen hovering over the page. He thought of the 3 men who had slipped into the sump that morning, swallowed by the grey ooze before anyone could grab a rope, their screams cut short by the sheer weight of the earth. He thought of the way the clay seemed to pulse, to breathe, as if the ground itself was hungry. "The mud," Arthur wrote, the ink flowing dark and wet, "is quite something. Bertie says it's only the earth trying to hug us back before the Bosch decides to send us a proper parcel of high explosive." He stopped, staring at the words. They looked absurd on the page, a joke typed out in the face of death, yet they were the only truth he could bear to send. "There, she'll laugh, or she'll think we've finally lost our wits. Either way, it's better than telling her about the sump." "Better," Bertie nodded. "Much better. Keep the girl smiling, Titch. That's your job. My job is the remembering. We all have our marching orders." Footsteps squelched along the duckboard, heavy and deliberate. Sergeant Major Evans appeared out of the gloom, his puttees perfectly wrapped despite the mire, his face a mask of impassive stone. He held a slip of paper in one gloved hand, the edges crisp and dry against the wet decay of the trench. "Corporal Higgs, Private Vance," Evans said, his voice devoid of inflection. He did not look at their mud-caked boots or the hollows under their eyes. "New standing order from battalion. Mud clearance to be conducted every hour on the hour. Use helmets. Dump over the parapet. Do not let the accumulation exceed 6 inches. Signed, Evans." He thrust the paper towards Arthur, who took it with trembling fingers. The typing was jagged, the ink slightly blurred, but the command was clear. 6 inches, as if the mud cared for measurements, as if the earth would stop its slow, creeping advance because a piece of paper told it to. "Every hour, Sarge?" Arthur asked, the exhaustion making his voice thick. "The men haven't slept in 30. The rain isn't stopping." Evans turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting Arthur's for a fraction of a second, cold and unreadable. "Orders are orders, Private. The trench must be maintained. See to it." He turned and walked away, his boots making the same sucking sound as everyone else's, though he carried himself as if walking on the pavement outside the War Office. The candle flame guttered in his wake, throwing wild shadows against the chalk walls. Arthur looked at the order, then at Bertie. Bertie sighed, a long, rattling exhalation that seemed to come from the bottom of his boots. He reached into his tunic again, not for the flask this time, but for the small, waterproof notebook. He flipped it open, the pages rustling softly. He took a pencil from behind his ear, the wood worn smooth by use, and made a quick note. "Evans," Bertie murmured, writing fast, "issued Order 44B regarding mud. Ignored the fact that Private Miller lost a boot to the sump 10 minutes ago. Ignored the look in Vance's eyes." He snapped the book shut, the sound final. "He'll be in there too, one day, along with the rest of us, but at least someone will know he did his duty." Arthur folded the order and tucked it into his pocket next to the letter for Elsie. The paper felt heavy, a brick of bureaucracy in a world of fluid chaos. He looked at the mud creeping up the side of the trench, already reclaiming the space they had just scooped out. It was a losing battle, a war within a war, fought with tin helmets against an enemy that could not be killed. "Best get to it then," Arthur said, reaching for his helmet. "Aye," Bertie replied. He slipped the notebook back into his inner pocket, pressing his hand flat against his chest for a moment, feeling the steady beat of his own heart against the paper record of the dead. He checked the pulse of the book, a silent reassurance that the stories were still safe, still waiting. Then he grabbed his helmet, the metal cold and slick in his grip. "Night watch starts in 5, Bertie said, his voice dropping to a whisper as he signaled the shift change to the men in the bay. "Let's give the earth a bit more room to hug us, shall we?" Arthur nodded, lifting the helmet. The mud waited, patient and endless, ready to swallow them whole if they stopped moving for even a second. He dug the rim into the sludge, preparing to lift, when a sound froze him, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the communication trench behind them. Not the rain, not the shelling. Someone was coming up the line, fast. The tapping stopped. A boot heel scraped flint, sharp, and sudden against the wet wood of the duckboard, followed by the wet slap of a hand slapping the trench wall to steady a stumbling gait. "Hold your fire," Bertie hissed, the words barely escaping his lips before the figure materialized from the grey curtain of rain. It was Socks Miller, or what remained of him after a run through the sector known as the Lip. His tunic hung in ragged strips, soaked through and heavy with water, dragging at his shoulders like a second skin of lead. Mud caked his face, filling the lines around his eyes and crusting in his eyebrows, leaving only the whites visible when he blinked. He did not stop moving until he collided with the sandbag revetment, sliding down it until his boots found purchase in the slurry. "Christ," Arthur breathed, dropping his helmet. The tin clattered into the muck, vanishing instantly beneath the surface. "Socks, you're meant to be at Battalion HQ." "HQ's gone," Socks gasped, his chest heaving so violently it looked as though his ribs might crack. He wiped a smear of grease and dirt from his mouth, revealing teeth that were startlingly white against the grime. "Cellar took a direct hit. Big one, 12-inch reckon, roof came down like a wet blanket." Bertie moved first, grabbing Socks by the collar of his ruined tunic and hauling him upright, ignoring the way the runner's legs buckled under the weight of his own exhaustion. "Julian." Inside, Socks choked out, pointing a trembling finger back towards the communication trench, the direction from which he had just fled. "With the Major, the telephone was ringing. They wouldn't leave the bloody phone." Arthur felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach, a sensation distinct from the chill of the rain soaking through his shirt. He looked at Bertie, seeing the same flicker of dread cross the corporal's face, a silent acknowledgement that the map of their world had just shifted again. The dugout was the only place that offered a semblance of dry wood, a place where a man could write a letter without the ink running into illegible blobs. If it was gone, then Julian was gone, or worse, trapped beneath tons of chalk and timber while the German guns kept up their rhythmic pounding. "How many?" Bertie asked, his voice low, stripping away the panic to get to the arithmetic of survival. "Two runners with me," Socks said, sliding further down the bag until he was sitting in the mud, too tired to care about the filth. "Jones and little Tommy, they didn't make the turn. Why, I caught Tommy's foot, dragged him back. I couldn't." He stopped, shaking his head, water spraying from his hair in a fine mist. "Couldn't stop, had to get word up. Shelling's lifting. They're coming over, 10 minutes, maybe less." Arthur scrambled for his rifle, leaning it against the parapet before grabbing his helmet from the sludge. He scraped the worst of the clay off the rim with his thumb, the metal cold and biting against his skin. "If they're coming over, we need to wake the bay. Evans will have the men in the reserve trench, but they won't hear the whistle if the wind's wrong." "Evans knows," Socks muttered, closing his eyes for a second, his head lolling back against the wet sandbags. "Saw him directing the lads from the fire step. Calm as you like. Told me to fetch you lot. Said the Fusiliers don't need a runner to tell them when to fight." Bertie reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the waterproof cover of his notebook before pulling out a small dented tin of bully beef. He popped the lid with his knife, the metal shrieking in the damp air, and shoved it towards Socks. "Eat, quickly. You've got sugar shock written all over your face." "Not hungry," Socks pushed the tin away, though his hand lingered near it, trembling. "Just need a minute, then I'm going back." "You're going nowhere," Arthur snapped, the fear making his voice sharper than he intended. "You've done your run, sit tight." "Got the post," Socks said suddenly, his eyes snapping open. He fumbled with the inside of his tunic, digging past the wet layers until he produced a small oilskin packet. It was miraculously dry, tucked deep against his body heat. "For you, Titch, and one for the lieutenant, though I suppose that's moot now." Arthur snatched the packet, his heart giving a hard, painful thump against his ribs. A letter from home, or perhaps from Julian, written before the roof fell in. The paper felt substantial, real, a tangible anchor in a world that was rapidly dissolving into chaos. He shoved it into his own pocket, next to the order from Evans, feeling the conflicting weights of bureaucracy and affection pressing against his thigh. "Julian might not be dead," Bertie said, more to himself than to the others. He was checking his rifle bolt, working the mechanism with practiced, rhythmic clicks. "Cellars don't always collapse completely. There could be an air pocket." "There's 12 feet of chalk on top of them, Bertie," Arthur said, the image of the arched ceiling, the wine racks, the field telephone ringing in the dark, flashing behind his eyes. Even if there's air, they can't dig them out before the Boche are in the trench. Then we hold the trench, Bertie replied, his voice flat, final. He stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers, leaving streaks of black mud on the khaki cloth. That's the job. Hold the line until the sappers can get a shovel in, or until we're all dead, whichever comes first. The sound of the barrage changed. The high-pitched whine of the incoming shells ceased, replaced by the deeper, rolling thunder of the creeping barrage moving forward, walking ahead of the German infantry like a wall of fire. The ground beneath their feet vibrated, a low, constant thrum that traveled up through the soles of their boots and settled in their teeth. "Here they come," Socks whispered, pushing himself up from the mud. He grabbed his rifle, the movement sluggish but determined, right on the dot. Arthur climbed the fire step, peering over the parapet. The no-man's land was a churning sea of smoke and explosions, the wire glittering briefly in the flashes of light before disappearing again into the gloom. Shapes were moving through the haze, grey uniforms blending with the mud, advancing with a terrifying, mechanical, steady pace. "Bertie," Arthur said, his voice steady despite his heart racing. "The notebook." "What about it?" Bertie was beside him now, resting his rifle on the sandbag, taking aim at the approaching shadows. "If things go wrong," Arthur said, watching the first grey figure stumble into the range of their rifles, "make sure Elsie gets the letter, and tell her the mud wasn't so bad, in the end." Bertie didn't look at him. He kept his eye down the sights, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I'll tell her whatever you like, Titch, but you'd better be here to write the rest of it yourself." The first German soldier emerged from the smoke, close enough to see the fear in his eyes, close enough to smell the stale tobacco and wet wool on his uniform. Bertie fired. The shot cracked loud and sharp, drowning out the rain for a split second. "Fire at will," Bertie shouted, the order tearing through the air. Arthur raised his rifle, the stock familiar and comforting against his shoulder. He exhaled slowly, just as Julian had taught him in the park behind the house in Bloomsbury years ago when the only thing they were hunting was rabbits. He squeezed the trigger. The recoil kicked back into his shoulder, a solid, honest punch. The line of grey figures wavered, then surged forward again, driven by officers behind them who had no intention of turning back. The trench filled with the noise of battle, the shouting, the cursing, the mechanical clatter of bolt actions working back and forth. Socks was beside them now, firing rapidly, his earlier exhaustion forgotten in the surge of survival instinct. "Come on then, you bastards," he yelled, his voice rising above the din. "Come and get us." Arthur reloaded, his fingers moving automatically, stripping the clip and slamming a fresh one home. He glanced at Bertie, who was firing with a grim, methodical rhythm, each shot a deliberate act of defiance against the tide of men crashing against their position. The notebook in Bertie's pocket was safe for now, pressed against his heart, a silent witness to another hour of the war. But as the grey coats swarmed closer, filling the trench with the smell of cordite and unwashed bodies, Arthur wondered how many more names Bertie would have to write before the book was full, and whether there would be anyone left alive to carry it home. The earth hugged them back, tight and suffocating, and the only way out was through the fire. The rain stopped being water and became a weight. It pressed the trench walls inward, turning the chalk into a grey slurry that sucked at boot heels with a wet, tearing sound, like a mouth testing the firmness of fruit. Arthur wiped his spectacles with a rag that was dirtier than the glass, smearing the grime until the world outside the parapet blurred into a watercolor of brown and gunmetal grey. The Germans had pulled back. Not far, just out of rifle range, leaving their dead in the wire to swell and darken under the relentless drizzle. The sudden absence of noise was worse than the barrage. It left room for thinking. "Cease fire," Bertie said. His voice was rough, stripped bare by hours of shouting over the din. He didn't lower his rifle immediately, keeping the bolt locked back, the brass casing ejecting with a bright clatter onto the mud floor. "Check your ammunition, and don't slip on the casings." Arthur leaned against the revetment, feeling the cold seep through his tunic. His shoulder throbbed where the stock had kicked, a dull, rhythmic ache that matched the pulse in his neck. He looked down at his boots. They were gone, swallowed whole by the ooze, leaving only the vague impression of leather laces disappearing into the brown. He had to scoop the mud out with his hands just to feel the sole of his foot. It was exhausting work, digging one's own grave while standing in it. Socks Miller was already moving along the line, collecting the empty clips, his movements jerky and efficient. He paused beside a crumpled figure near the communication trench, a lad from the second who had taken a round to the throat 10 minutes prior. Socks didn't look at the face. He just unclipped the ammunition pouches, his fingers quick and respectful, before moving on to the next man. The ledger in his head was updating itself, item by item, soul by soul. Arthur fumbled in his pocket and pulled out the oilskin packet Socks had delivered. The paper inside was dry, a miracle in this wet hell. He found a relatively flat spot on a sandbag, wiped it with his sleeve, and uncapped his fountain pen. The ink was thick, sluggish in the cold. He needed to write to Elsie. She would be worrying. She always worried when the post was late, imagining him shot or gassed or lost in some bureaucratic limbo of the War Office. He had to give her something solid to hold on to, something that wasn't this mud. Dearest Elsie, he wrote, the nib scratching softly, an intimate sound amidst the wreckage. The weather has turned decidedly autumnal. The rain is persistent, turning the ground into a sort of clinging clay that makes walking quite an adventure. Bertie says it is only the earth trying to hug us back, which is a cheerful way of looking at it, I suppose. He paused, the pen hovering over the paper. 3 men lay dead within 10 yards of him. Private Miller, whose name he barely knew, and 2 others whose faces were now indistinguishable from the mud that covered them. Their mothers would receive a form letter, a sterile notification of death in the service of king and country. They would not know about the way Miller's hand had twitched for a full minute after the bullet hit, or how the mud had filled his mouth before he stopped breathing. Arthur dipped the pen again. He could tell her about the cold, about the hunger, about the fear that sat in his gut like a stone. He crossed out adventure, too frivolous. It makes for difficult walking, he amended, but we are managing. The rations are adequate, though the tea is mostly water. Bertie is in good spirits as always. He keeps a notebook, you know, intending to write down all our stories for when we return. He insists we shall all be back for tea in Camden Town by Christmas. I find I almost believe him when he says it. A lie, a necessary, gentle lie. If he told her the truth, that Bertie's notebook was a catalogue of the dead, that the mud didn't hug but strangled, she would never sleep again. She would see his face in every shadow, hear the wet tear of the shells in every thunderclap. Better she imagine him muddy and tired than terrified and alone. Rum issue, Bertie said, appearing at his elbow. He held a small dented flask, the metal tarnished black. 1 capful each, saves the cold getting into the bones. Arthur capped his pen and took the flask. The smell of the rum was sharp, medicinal, cutting through the stench of wet wool and decay. He took a sip, the liquid burning a path down his throat, warming his chest for a fleeting second before the cold rushed back in. Tar, Arthur said. He handed the flask back, writing to Elsie, telling her the mud is affectionate. Bertie chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. He pulled the small, waterproof notebook from his tunic. It was bulging now, the pages swollen with moisture despite the oilskin wrapping. He flipped it open with a thumb stained black with grease and dirt. The pages were filled with cramped, hurried script, names, dates, last words, if there had been any. Half full, Bertie said quietly, tracing a line of text with his finger. Miller, young Henderson, that lad from Leeds who sang in the choir, all there. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and weary but clear. I'm going to deliver these, Titch, personally, hand them to the mothers. Tell them how their boys died, not the official version, the real one, that they weren't afraid, or that they were but they stood their ground anyway. You'll have to survive first, Arthur said. The words felt heavy, clumsy. Plan is to do just that, Bertie replied, snapping the book shut. He patted his chest, right over the heart, ensuring the book was secure. Someone has to carry the memory. The War Office won't do it. They'll just send a telegram and a medal, cold as ice. These lads deserve more than a piece of paper saying, regret to inform you. Arthur looked at the notebook. It was a small thing, insignificant against the scale of the slaughter, yet it felt heavier than the artillery pieces battering the lines miles away. It was a promise, a debt owed to the dead. I'll help, Arthur said. When we get back, I'll help you write the letters. Bertie nodded, a sharp, jerky motion. Good, might need the practice. My handwriting's going to pot. He gestured to the trench. Best get back to it. Evans will be doing rounds soon, once the mud cleared before nightfall. As if summoned by the name, Sergeant Major Evans appeared at the end of the bay. He moved with a stiff, precise gait, avoiding the deeper pools of sludge with an uncanny instinct. His uniform was immaculate, the buttons polished, the puttees wrapped with mathematical precision. He held a slip of paper in one gloved hand. "Attention," Evans barked. The few men still standing straightened, wincing as their stiff muscles protested. Evans stopped in front of them, his face a mask of impassive granite. He didn't look at the dead men. He didn't look at the mud caking their trousers. He looked only at the order in his hand. "Corporal Higgs," Evans said, his voice devoid of inflection. "Mud clearance, immediate, use helmets, deepen the sumps. Water table is rising." "Sir," Bertie said. "And tell your men," Evans added, his eyes flickering briefly to Arthur, then away, "that hygiene is paramount. Disease is as deadly as the enemy. Keep the trench clean." He turned on his heel and marched away, the order fluttering in his hand like a white flag of surrender to the absurdity of it all. Clean the trench, in this deluge, with helmets. Arthur watched him go, a surge of anger hot and bright in his chest. Clean, as if scrubbing the walls would wash away the blood, or the fear, or the names in Bertie's book. He looked down at his letter to Elsie. The ink was beginning to run, a blue tear spreading from the word Christmas. "He's mad," Socks muttered, spitting a wad of tobacco into the sludge. "Absolutely balmy, thinks we can bail out the ocean with a tin hat." "He's doing his job," Bertie said, though his voice lacked conviction. He tucked the notebook away again, the movement protective, final. "We all are." Arthur folded the letter, pressing the damp edges together. He slipped it into the oilskin packet, sealing Elsie away from the reality of the lip. She would read his words about the affectionate earth and smile, perhaps, or worry a little less. She would never know about the 3 men in the mud, or the notebook full of ghosts, or the way the rain washed the color out of everything until the world was just gray and brown and black. He picked up his helmet, the metal cold and slick in his grip. The mud waited, thick and hungry, ready to be scooped and thrown and scooped again. A Sisyphean task in a universe that had forgotten the point of effort. "Bertie," Arthur said, his voice low. "Yes, Tidgy. If I don't make it." "Don't," Bertie cut in, sharp and sudden. "No last words, not yet. We've got sumps to dig." Arthur nodded. He picked up the helmet and stepped into the muck. The suction held him fast, a cold embrace that promised to keep him forever if he stayed still too long. He began to scoop, the mud heavy and cloying, sliding back into the hole as fast as he threw it out. Beside him, Bertie did the same, his movements rhythmic, steady. The notebook pressed against his ribcage, a silent heartbeat in the dripping dark, waiting for the next name to be added or for the war to end, whichever came first. The rain fell harder, drumming on the tin hats, masking the sound of the shovel biting into the earth, masking the sound of men breathing, waiting, hoping that tomorrow would be different, even though they knew, with a certainty that sat heavier than the mud, that it would not. The summons arrived not by runner, but by the absence of noise. Evans had gone. The slap of his puttees against the trench wall, the sharp bark of orders regarding sumps and hygiene, the very pressure of his immaculate presence had lifted, leaving a vacuum that sucked the air from Arthur's lungs. In the sudden quiet, the only sound was the wet, sucking greed of the mud as Bertie drove his helmet into the slurry, scooping and heaving with a rhythm that felt less like labor and more like prayer. "Rations," Bertie grunted, not looking up. A glob of clay flew from the rim of his steel pot, landing with a soft plip near Arthur's boot. "HQ, now, before Evans remembers he forgot to hate you for something." Arthur wiped his hands on his tunic, smearing the grey slick across the khaki wool. He needed the bully beef. He needed the tea that tasted of paraffin and tin. But mostly, he needed to move, to escape the crushing weight of Bertie's notebook, which now sat heavy in the corporal's pocket, a ledger of the dead waiting for new entries. Keep your head down, Arthur said. Always, Bertie replied, the word fragmented by the effort of lifting another load of earth. Unless the Boche decides to aim low, then I'll look up just to spite him. Arthur turned, his boots making that obscene squelching noise with every step, the sound of a giant mouth chewing on wet leather. He moved away from the front line, away from the lip where the earth hugged them back with such fatal affection, and began the crawl towards the rear. The communication trench narrowed here, the walls pressing in, slick with a slime that felt alive against his palms when he stumbled. He did not stumble. He forced his legs to work, mechanical pistons driving through the resistance. 200 yards, a lifetime in the wet. The entrance to the battalion headquarters dugout was a scar in the chalk, hidden beneath a corrugated iron roof that groaned under the weight of the accumulated soil. Arthur ducked under the canvas flap, the change in atmosphere hitting him like a physical blow. The smell shifted instantly from the sweet rot of unburied flesh and wet wool to something sharper, more intimate, damp earth, stale tobacco smoke, and the metallic tang of the field telephone. It was too quiet inside. Usually the dugout buzzed with the low murmur of clerks, the scratching of pens on forms, the clipped voices of runners delivering orders that would get men killed. Today, the air hung still, thick with the smoke of a dying fire in the small stove tucked into the corner. Julian sat alone at the map table. He was not writing. He was not studying the contour lines of Thiepval or the red markers denoting enemy strongpoints. He was staring at the field telephone, his hands resting on the baize cloth, trembling with a violence that made the teacup beside them shiver. The liquid inside danced, rippling in concentric circles, though the phone remained silent, a black monolith that refused to ring. "Sir," Arthur said, the title feeling wrong, heavy, and ill-fitting in his mouth. Julian flinched. His hand jerked, knocking the teacup. Brown liquid spilled across the map, soaking into the paper, blurring the grid lines of Sector 4. The stain spread like a wound, eating the ink, destroying the strategic geometry of the trench system. "Tea," Julian whispered. He did not look at Arthur. His eyes were fixed on the telephone receiver, wide and unblinking, as if expecting it to speak in a voice only he could hear. "It's cold. Everything goes cold so quickly here, Titch, even the heat, even the anger." Arthur stepped forward, his boots leaving muddy prints on the wooden floorboards. He reached for a rag to mop the spill, but stopped. On the floor, half hidden beneath the leg of the table, lay a sheet of paper. It had been crumpled and then smoothed out again, the creases forming a jagged landscape of their own. Arthur's gaze dropped, caught by the stark black ink near the bottom. It was a fitness report, Form A12, the kind that sent officers home to Blighty, to hospitals in Brighton or Bath, away from the mud and the whiz-bangs. The medical officers section was blank, but the company commander's signature box was filled. Arthur knew Captain Gower's signature. He had seen it on 100 orders, a confident, looping scrawl that commanded authority. This was not it. The ink on the paper was a clumsy forgery, the loops too tight, the pressure uneven, the hand that held the pen shaking so badly the letters looked like they were trying to crawl off the page. Yet the name was there, Gower, and below it, in a handwriting Arthur recognized from letters written in Bloomsbury Gardens, from notes passed in schoolrooms a decade ago, was Julian's own shaky endorsement recommending immediate evacuation. Julian had signed his own rescue warrant, and then, in a panic, had tried to make it official by forging the captain's approval. The ink was still wet. It glistened under the flicker of the oil lamp, a fresh, dark betrayal of the regulations that held the army together. If Evans found this, if the medical officer saw the discrepancy, Julian would not be sent home. He would be court-martialed, or worse, he would be stripped of command and left to rot in the ranks, a broken thing among broken men. Arthur looked at Julian. The lieutenant was still staring at the phone, his breathing shallow, rapid. He hadn't noticed the paper on the floor. He hadn't noticed Arthur seeing it. "Titch," Julian said, his voice cracking. "Did you hear it? Just then, the wire, it was singing again. A dreadful violin concerto. I couldn't find the sheet music." Arthur bent down. His fingers brushed the damp paper. The ink smeared slightly against his thumb, a dark stain that would not wash off easily. He felt the heat of the stove on his back, a comforting, dangerous warmth. He could hand the paper to Julian. He could point out the mistake, the forgery, the fatal error. He could tell him to tear it up, to burn it, to pretend it never existed. Or he could do nothing. To do nothing was to condemn Julian to stay. To stay was to die. The logic was simple, brutal, and undeniable. But Arthur looked at his friend's hollow cheeks, the tremor in the hands that had once played Chopin with such effortless grace, and he knew that sending Julian away now in this state might kill him faster than a German shell. The world outside this dugout, the world of normalcy and recovery, was a place Julian no longer understood. Here in the mud with Arthur, he had an anchor. A fragile, rotting anchor, but an anchor nonetheless. Arthur straightened up. He did not speak. He walked to the stove, the metal door hot enough to sting his palm. He opened it. The flames inside licked eagerly, orange and hungry. He dropped the paper into the fire. The edges curled instantly, blackening, the ink vanishing into the ash. The forgery, the plea for help, the evidence of Julian's disintegration, all of it twisted and shriveled, turning into nothing more than a wisp of grey smoke that joined the stale air of the dugout. Julian finally looked up. His eyes met Arthur's, and for a second the fog cleared. Terror flashed in them, raw and naked. He saw what Arthur had done. He understood the complicity, the silent pact sealed in flame. "You burned it," Julian whispered. The accusation hung in the air, fragile as glass. "It was wet," Arthur said, his voice steady, lying with an ease that frightened him. "Ruined the map. Useless." Julian stared at him. The trembling in his hands slowed just a fraction. He reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the table, grounding himself. "I can't go, Titch," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush, low and desperate. "If they take me away, if they send me back, you won't be there. The reality, it only works if you're here. You're the only thing that's real. Don't tell the MO, please, don't let them take me." Arthur felt the weight of the request settle on his shoulders, heavier than any pack, heavier than the mud. He had just condemned his friend to the hell that was eating him alive. He had chosen loyalty over survival. "I won't tell," Arthur said. The words tasted like ash. Julian slumped, the tension draining from his frame, leaving him looking old, ancient. "Good, good, we must keep the line holding. The wire is singing, you know, we must listen." Arthur turned away. He grabbed the crate of rations from the corner, the tin cans clinking softly, a mundane sound in the face of such monumental deception. "I'll get these back to the lads, sir. Bertie's digging sumps." "Tell him," Julian paused, his gaze drifting back to the silent telephone. "Tell him to keep his head down. The music is getting louder." Arthur nodded, though he knew Julian wasn't really speaking to him anymore. He ducked under the canvas flap and stepped back out into the rain. The cold hit him instantly, shocking after the stifling warmth of the dugout. He clutched the crate of rations to his chest, feeling the heat of the stove still radiating from his back, a phantom warmth that offered no comfort. He began the trudge back to the front line, his boots sinking into the mire with every step. Behind him, the dugout sat silent, guarding its secret. Ahead, the mud waited, ready to swallow them all. He had saved Julian from the court-martial, but he had left him in the hands of the war, and Arthur knew, with a certainty that settled cold in his gut, that he had just made a terrible mistake. The rain did not fall so much as it hung, a suspended grey curtain that turned the communication trench into a sluice of liquid chalk and rot. Arthur's boots made a sucking sound with every step, a wet, obscene noise like a mouth chewing on gristle, and the crate of bully beef dug into his ribs with the dull, persistent ache of a bruise forming. He kept his head down, chin tucked into the collar of a tunic that smelled of wet wool and the sour tang of old sweat, moving through the gloom with the automatic, shuffling gait of a man who has forgotten how to walk upright. The heat from the stove still prickled against his spine, a ghost sensation that refused to fade despite the biting damp of the open air, reminding him of the fire that had consumed the evidence, the paper turning to ash while Julian watched with those hollow, terrified eyes. It was done. There was no taking it back. The forgery was gone, reduced to a wisp of grey smoke that had joined the stale, recycled air of the dugout, and Arthur had lied to his friend's face with a steadiness that made his own stomach turn over. He had chosen loyalty over sense, binding himself to a man who was unraveling thread by thread, and the weight of that choice sat heavy in his gut, heavier than the rations he carried, heavier than the mud that tried to pull his boots off with every step. "Did you?" The voice came from the shadows ahead, a sharp, hissed whisper that cut through the drumming of the rain. Arthur flinched, his grip tightening on the crate until his knuckles went white, before he recognized the silhouette detaching itself from the trench wall. Socks Miller stepped into the dim light, his face smeared with grease and dirt, a pair of officer's socks protruding comically from his tunic pocket alongside a tin of peaches that definitely did not belong to the ranks. "Keep your voice down, you fool," Arthur muttered, shifting the crate to free one hand for a reflexive shove against Sock's chest. "Do you want the whole battalion to know you're here?" Socks grinned, a flash of white teeth in the gloom, utterly unrepentant. "Battalion's asleep, Titch, or dead, mostly asleep. Evans is doing his rounds near the second bay, looking like he's swallowed a lemon, so I thought I'd relieve him of some of his burden." He tapped the tin of peaches. "Officer's mess, fresh from Blighty. Thought you lads might need a bit of sugar to wash down that horse meat." "We don't need your stolen goods," Arthur said, though he didn't move away when Socks offered the tin. The smell of the syrup, sweet and cloying, cut through the stench of the trench, a sudden, violent reminder of a world where fruit grew on trees and wasn't packed in metal cans amidst the mud. "And if Evans catches you, he'll have you digging latrines until your hands bleed." "Evans sees what he wants to see," Socks replied, his voice dropping to a murmur as he leaned closer, the humor fading from his eyes. "Speaking of seeing, you just come from the HQ cellar, saw you duck out." Arthur stiffened, the mud seemed to tighten around his ankles. "Collecting rations, standard issue." "Right," Socks nodded slowly, his gaze sharp, missing nothing despite the grime on his face. "Standard issue, and the lieutenant, he holding up." "He's fine," Arthur said, the lie coming too quickly, too easily. He looked away, focusing on a sandbag that had collapsed into the trench floor, a mound of wet earth that looked disturbingly like a shallow grave. "Just tired, we all are." Socks didn't press it, but the silence between them stretched, thick and uncomfortable, filled only by the drip, drip, drip of water running down the trench walls. He reached out, not for the crate, but to adjust the strap on Arthur's shoulder, his fingers rough and cold. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Titch. More than usual, I mean." "Just the rain," Arthur said, forcing his legs to move again, pushing past Socks before the Cockney runner could pry any deeper. "Get back to your hole, Socks, before someone misses those peaches." "Cheers, Titch," Socks called softly after him, the sound fading as he melted back into the shadows. "Save a bit of that sugar for Bertie. He's got a sweet tooth, that one." Arthur didn't answer. He kept walking, the rhythm of his boots in the mud providing a shallow mechanical comfort, a metronome to measure out the seconds until he reached the safety of his own dugout where he could pretend, for a little while longer, that everything was as it should be. But the image of Julian's hands, trembling so violently they spilled tea onto the map, kept flashing in his mind, superimposed over the dark, zigzagging walls of the trench. Those hands had signed a death warrant, not for an enemy, but for themselves, and Arthur had burned it. He had fed the truth to the fire to keep the illusion alive, and now he had to carry the consequences back to the men who trusted him to keep them safe. The trench narrowed ahead, the walls pressing in close enough to touch, the smell of damp earth and unwashed bodies growing stronger, more oppressive. Somewhere in the distance, a rifle cracked, a single, sharp report that echoed oddly in the confined space, followed by the dull thud of a bullet striking sandbags. Arthur didn't flinch. He just tightened his grip on the crate and kept moving, one foot in front of the other, trudging through the mire towards the place where Bertie would be waiting with his notebook and his fatalistic jokes, unaware that the officer who commanded them was barely holding onto his sanity, unaware that the man walking towards them had just become an accomplice to a slow, inevitable suicide. He reached the entrance to their sector and paused, listening. The sound of digging came from within, the rhythmic scrape of a shovel against clay, steady and mundane. Bertie was still there, still working, still alive. For now. Arthur took a deep breath, the air tasting of cordite and wet wool, and stepped down into the dugout, the heat of the stove on his back feeling less like warmth and more like the brand of a criminal. "Bertie," he called out, his voice sounding strangely loud in the confined space. "I've got the rations, and Socks found some peaches." The digging stopped. Bertie looked up from the corner, his face streaked with mud, a small waterproof notebook resting on his knee. He smiled, a tired, crooked thing that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Peaches? You're a wizard, Titch. Did you steal them from under the Kaiser's nose?" "Something like that," Arthur said, setting the crate down with a clatter of tin on wood. He wiped his hands on his trousers, trying to rub away the invisible stain of the ash, the memory of the burning paper. "How's the sump?" "Deep enough to drown a rat," Bertie replied, closing his notebook and tucking it away. "But the water's rising faster than I can dig it out. Seems the earth wants to hug us back again." Arthur looked at his friend, at the easy humor that masked the fear, the fatigue, the sheer grinding attrition of it all. He thought of Julian in the cellar, staring at a silent phone, hearing music that wasn't there, and felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to scream, to tear the dugout apart, to tell Bertie that none of it mattered, that they were all just waiting for the end. But he swallowed the urge, forcing it down deep where it joined the other unsaid things, the other horrors they carried in silence. "Pass me a tin opener then," Arthur said, his voice steady, masking the tremor in his hands. "Let's see if these peaches taste like Blighty or just like tin." Bertie tossed him the tool, the metal glinting in the dim light of the candle. "Careful with the edges, Titch. Don't want to cut yourself. We haven't got enough blood to spare as it is." Arthur caught the opener, the metal cold against his palm. He looked at the crate, at the tins of meat and fruit that represented life, however meager, and then back at Bertie, who was already opening his notebook again, ready to record another name, another day, another step towards the inevitable. "No," Arthur said softly, pressing the opener against the lid of the peach tin. "We haven't." The lid gave way with a sharp hiss, releasing the sweet, sugary scent into the stale air, a small, defiant act of normalcy in a world that had forgotten what normal meant. Arthur scooped out a slice of fruit with his finger and put it in his mouth, the sweetness overwhelming, almost painful, and for a second, just a second, he closed his eyes and pretended he was back in Bloomsbury, sitting in a garden with Julian, listening to the piano, far away from the mud and the rain and the terrible, singing wire. But the illusion shattered as quickly as it came. The sound of a whistle blew in the distance, sharp and urgent, cutting through the quiet of the dugout. Bertie froze, his pen hovering over the page. Arthur opened his eyes, the taste of sugar turning to ash in his mouth. "Roll call," Bertie said, his voice flat, "or worse." Arthur stood up, wiping his sticky fingers on his tunic. "Better go see what Evans wants." "Careful, Titch," Bertie called after him as he moved towards the flap. "Don't let the mud hug you too tight." Arthur didn't answer. He pushed through the canvas and stepped back out into the rain, the whistle screaming in his ears, the heat of his secret burning hotter than ever against his back. The whistle didn't stop. It soared through the damp air, a thin metallic shriek that dragged the rain into a frenzy against the canvas flap. Arthur pushed out, the wet wool of his tunic heavy as a shroud, and turned not towards the parade ground where Evans would be counting heads, but back along the communication trench, towards the deeper dark of the battalion headquarters. His boots sucked at the clay, each step a negotiation with the ground that wanted to keep him. He carried the crate of rations under one arm, the tin lids clinking softly, a betrayal of movement in the grey twilight. He found the entrance to the cellar dugout guarded by a sentry who looked half asleep, leaning on a reversed rifle. The man stepped aside without a word, recognizing the burden in Arthur's arms, and the private descended the rough-hewn steps into the earth. The air down here was different, thick with the smell of stale tobacco, damp chalk, and something sweeter, like rotting flowers left too long in a vase. It was the smell of Julian. The main room was lit by a single oil lamp, its flame guttering in the draft from the ventilation shaft. Julian sat at the map table, but he wasn't looking at the lines of contour or the red pencil marks denoting enemy positions. He was staring at the field telephone, a black bakelite beast that sat silent and dead on the desk. His hands rested on the table, palms down, but they were shaking. Not a tremor, but a violent, rhythmic spasm that rattled the enamel mug of tea beside his elbow. Arthur stopped in the doorway. "Sir." Julian didn't turn. The shaking intensified, a mechanical jitter that traveled up his forearms. His fingers twitched, hooked like claws, and then jerked sideways. The mug tipped. Brown liquid spilled across the topographic map of Thiepval, soaking into the paper, blurring the blue lines of the trenches until they looked like weeping wounds. "Julian," Arthur said, dropping the crate. The tins hit the floor with a dull thud, rolling slightly in the mud tracked onto the boards. "It's singing again," Julian whispered, his voice brittle, stripped of the officer's baritone they had known in Bloomsbury. "Can't you hear it? The wire, it's playing a concerto, a dreadful, scraping thing in E minor." "There's no wire here, Julian, just the phone." Arthur moved closer, the mud on his boots leaving dark prints on the floorboards. He reached out, intending to steady the man's shoulder, but stopped when he saw the paper on the floor. It had fallen from Julian's lap, landing face up near the stove where the embers glowed a sullen red. Arthur crouched, his knees cracking, and picked it up. It was a fitness report. Form A. The header was printed in crisp military type, but the handwriting below was a disaster. Recommendation for immediate evacuation to base hospital. The signature at the bottom was supposed to be Captain Halloway's, the company commander. It was a clumsy forgery, the loops of the H too tight, the ink still glistening wet where Julian's trembling hand had pressed too hard. Arthur held the paper up. The heat from the stove washed over his face. He looked at Julian, who was now tracing the spill of tea on the map with a shaking finger, muttering about sheet music and missing notes. If Evans saw this, if the medical officer got wind of a forged evacuation order, Julian wouldn't just be sent home. He'd be court-martialed for fraud, disgraced, stripped of his commission, and likely locked in a cell in Amiens while the battalion went over the top without him. Or worse, they'd label him a malingerer, tie him to a post, and let the German guns do the sentencing. Arthur looked at the stove. The iron door was slightly ajar, the glow within pulsing like a slow heartbeat. "Julian," Arthur said, his voice low, "look at me." Julian's head snapped up. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown dark, swallowing the iris. There was no recognition there, only a raw, animal terror. "They're coming for the music, Arthur. They want to stop the playing." "No one's coming," Arthur lied. He stood up, the paper crinkling in his grip. He walked to the stove, the heat radiating against his shins. He didn't hesitate. He couldn't afford the luxury of hesitation. He fed the corner of the form into the gap in the door. The paper caught instantly. The flame licked up the edge, blackening the ink, consuming the forgery. The words "immediate evacuation" curled into ash, turning grey and fragile before disintegrating into the fire. Julian watched, his breathing hitching in his throat, a ragged, wet sound. He didn't move to stop it. He just watched the evidence of his breakdown vanish into the heat. As the last corner turned to dust, Julian slumped forward, his forehead resting on the wet map. "You burnt it," he whispered, the words muffled by the paper. "You burnt the way out." Arthur leaned against the table, the wood cold against his hip. "There is no way out, Julian, not for you, not yet." Julian lifted his head. A smear of tea stained his cheek. "They'll send me home. The M.O., he knows. He looks at me and he sees the cracks." "Then don't let him see," Arthur said, the words tasting like bile. "Pull yourself together, for the men, for me." "I can't," Julian pleaded, his hands gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white, the trembling momentarily arrested by sheer force of will. "If I go home, Arthur, who will write to you? Who will remember the garden? It's only real if I'm here. If I leave, it all becomes a dream. You become a dream." He reached out, his fingers brushing Arthur's sleeve, desperate, clinging. "Don't tell Evans. Don't tell the M.O. Promise me, Titch. Promise you won't let them take me away from the music." Arthur looked down at his friend, at the broken thing that wore the face of the boy who had taught him to ride a bicycle on the pavement in Camden. He thought of the safety of Blighty, the quiet streets, the absence of whiz-bangs. He thought of saving Julian. And then he thought of the court-martial, the disgrace, the likely end of a man who couldn't survive the shame. To save him, he had to condemn him to stay. "I promise," Arthur said. The words felt heavy, final, like a stone dropped down a well. "I won't say a word." Julian exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to empty his lungs completely. He sat back, the tension draining from his shoulders, leaving him looking smaller, older. Good, good. Then we can finish the movement, just need to find the tempo. Arthur stepped back from the table. The air in the dugout felt thinner now, charged with the weight of the lie they had just sealed. He picked up the crate of rations again, the handles biting into his palm. I have to go, Sir Evans will be looking for the rations. Of course, Julian said, his voice regaining a fragment of its old polish, though his eyes remained fixed on the silent telephone. Carry on, Vance, and tell Higgs I said the mud is looking particularly festive today. Right you are, sir. Arthur turned and climbed the steps, emerging back into the rain. The whistle had stopped, replaced by the low murmur of voices and the tramping of boots as the platoon formed up. He joined the line, falling in behind Bertie, who glanced back with a raised eyebrow but said nothing. The rain plastered Arthur's hair to his skull, cold and relentless. He could feel the heat of the stove still radiating from his back, a phantom brand marking him as an accomplice. He had saved Julian from the firing squad of bureaucracy, only to leave him in the line of fire of the Germans. He tightened his grip on the crate, the metal edges digging into his flesh, and marched forward into the grey, carrying the rations that would keep men alive for another day, knowing that for his friend, survival was the cruelest punishment of all. The scrape of a boot sole against wood cut through the damp air before Arthur even pushed the canvas flap aside. He dropped the ration crate, the metal handles clattering against the chalk floor, and stepped into the gloom. Socks Miller lay curled against the lower bunk, one leg twisted at an unnatural angle beneath him, dragging a haversack tight against his chest, as if it contained the crown jewels. Blood soaked the putty on his right shin, dark and slick in the candlelight, pooling slowly towards the drainage channel cut into the earth. Arthur crossed the space in 3 strides, knees hitting the hard ground beside the runner. Hold still, Arthur said, his hands already working at the muddy fabric of the trousers. Let me see the damage. Socks flinched, teeth bared in a grimace that might have been a smile in better company. He shook his head, a jerky, bird-like motion, and tightened his grip on the sack. Ain't nothing, Titch, just a kiss from a shrapnel bird, grazed me is all. It's soaking the floor, Socks, lift the leg. Arthur yanked the fabric up, exposing the flesh beneath. The wound was jagged, a raw red mouth gaping open where a piece of metal had torn through the calf muscle, no artery spurting, but enough blood to leave a man weak if left unchecked. He grabbed the field dressing from his own tunic, tearing the packet open with his teeth, and pressed the gauze hard against the wound. Socks hissed through clenched teeth, fingers digging into the straw mattress behind him. Bloody hell, mate, gentle does it. Better hurt now than bleed out before dawn. Arthur wrapped the bandage tight, knotting the ends with a sharp tug. What were you doing out there? The barrage didn't lift until 10 minutes ago. Socks slumped back, the tension draining from his shoulders now that the blood was staunched. He patted the haversack, wiping a smear of mud from the canvas flap. Had a delivery to make. Officers like their breakfast, don't they, even when the sky is falling? You stole from the mess again. Arthur sat back on his heels, wiping his hands on his trousers. The smell of copper and wet wool hung heavy in the small space. Evans will have you shot if he finds out. Or worse, he'll have you running wires in no man's land for a month. Evans won't find out, not unless you tell him. Socks shifted, wincing as the leg moved, and reached into the haversack. He pulled out a small book, bound in oilcloth to keep the damp out. The edges were swollen with moisture, the cover stained with grease and dirt. Besides, I didn't steal it. I liberated it. There's a difference. There isn't. There is to the dead. Socks opened the book. The pages stuck together, requiring a wet thumb to separate them. He turned to a fresh sheet where a list had been written in careful, looping script. Look. Arthur leaned in. The candle flame flickered, casting long shadows against the chalk walls. The list was not of rations, but of names. Beside each name was an item. T. G. Miller, a circumflex 1 tin peaches. CPL, J. Higgs, a circumflex half-pack woodbines. LT, J. Thorne, a circumflex 1 pair gloves, left. That's Bertie's tobacco, Arthur said, voice low. He lost his pack in the mud last week, said he'd go mad without a smoke. He won't go mad, not yet. Socks traced the line with a dirty finger. And Julian, he loses his glove something fierce, picks at the wool until there's holes in the fingers. I found these in the captain's stash. Size matches. You're keeping a ledger of the dead. Arthur stared at the book, a cold knot forming in his stomach. You're writing them down before they're gone. Someone has to. Socks closed the book, holding it against his chest. His eyes were dull, rimmed with exhaustion, but the focus remained sharp. The telegrams don't say nothing, do they? Regret to inform. Killed in action, cold as ice. This way they take something with them, something warm. It's madness, Socks. You're risking court-martial for a tin of peaches. It's not for the peaches. Socks shifted again, his head lolling to the side as the adrenaline faded. The pain was catching up, dragging him down into the straw. It's for the knowing that they were here, that they liked peaches, that Julian needed gloves. He drifted then, the exhaustion of the run and the blood loss pulling him under. His breathing deepened, becoming a ragged whistle in the quiet dugout. The ledger slipped from his fingers, landing open on the straw beside him. Arthur did not move immediately. He watched the rise and fall of Sock's chest, listening to the distant thump of German artillery probing the wire outside, a rhythmic booming that shook the dust from the ceiling beams. He looked down at the open book. The entry for Julian stared back at him. 1 pair gloves left. Arthur reached out, his hand hovering over the page before he withdrew it. He opened the haversack, pushing aside the tins of bully beef and the stolen jam. There, wrapped in a scrap of dry newspaper, lay the gloves, grey wool, thick knit, 1 pair. He lifted them out. They were heavy with the scent of the officer's mess, smelling of lavender soap and tobacco, a stark contrast to the reek of the trench. He turned them over in his hands. They were intact. A full pair, but the ledger specified left. Why mark them left? Arthur looked at Socks, sleeping deeply now, face smeared with grime. The runner had not made a mistake. He had marked them left because he expected Julian to lose the right, or perhaps because he had already found the right glove on a body somewhere in the chalk, waiting for the matching pair to complete the set for the burial. Arthur folded the gloves slowly, pressing the wool flat. He tucked them into his own tunic pocket against his ribs, where the heat of his body could keep them dry. The weight of them sat heavy against his heart, a tangible promise of a loss that had not yet occurred. He blew out the candle, plunging the dugout into darkness, and listened to the rain starting up again outside, tapping against the wood like fingers waiting for an answer. Darkness swallowed the dugout, thick and suffocating as wet wool. Arthur sat still, the gloves burning a hole in his tunic pocket against his ribs. The scent of lavender soap drifted up, absurdly clean, clashing with the rot of the straw and the sour tang of Socks' drying blood. Outside, the rain began in earnest, a rhythmic drumming on the corrugated iron roof that drowned out the softer sounds of breathing. It was not the gentle fall of Camden Town, where water ran off slate into gutters and washed the soot from the pavement. This was a deluge designed to drown the world, turning the Somme into a vast, sucking bog that claimed boots and bodies with equal indifference. Socks shifted in his sleep, a low groan escaping his lips as the leg twinged. Arthur did not move to help him. He kept his hands flat on his knees, fingers spread wide to feel the vibration of the earth. The German artillery had stopped its probing, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the noise. It was the silence of a held breath, of a predator waiting for the prey to expose a flank. Somewhere beyond the wire, a flare hissed upward, casting a brief, magnesium glare through the cracks in the timbering. The light bleached the color from the dugout, turning Socks' grime-streaked face into a death mask for 3 seconds before fading back into the gloom. In that flash, Arthur saw the ledger again, lying open on the straw. 1 pair gloves left. The specificity of it gnawed at him. Why not just gloves? Why specify the left hand unless the right was already gone, lost to the chalk and clay of a crater edge? Julian had worn those gloves only yesterday, picking at the wool near the thumb, muttering about the wire singing in the wind. He had been lucid then, or close to it, his eyes focused on Arthur's face rather than drifting through some internal hellscape, but the fracture lines were showing. The letters from Bloomsbury had stopped coming weeks ago, replaced by scribbles that made no sense, talk of violins and sheet music that did not exist. Arthur reached into his pocket and touched the wool again. It was dry, perfectly, impossibly dry. "You're a fool, Socks," he whispered, the words barely audible over the rain. "A thieving, stubborn fool." Socks murmured something unintelligible, his hand twitching towards the book. Arthur leaned forward, careful not to jar the stretcher, and picked up the ledger. The oilcloth cover was slick with mud, but the pages inside were protected, the ink still dark and legible despite the damp air. He ran a finger down the list. T.G. Miller, dead 3 days now, blown apart by a whiz-bang while fixing a communications line. C.P.L. J. Higgs, still alive, currently asleep in the front line, unaware that his tobacco ration had been secured posthumously by a thief in the rear. And Julian. The entry for Julian sat alone at the bottom of the page, isolated from the others. Arthur traced the loop of the J. Julian had taught him to write that way years ago, in a sunlit classroom where the only danger was the headmaster's cane. They had shared everything then, books, sweets, the secret fear that they were not quite like the other boys. Now they shared a trench, a war, and a pair of stolen gloves that smelled of an officer's wash basin. A distant thump shook the ground, sending a trickle of dust down from the ceiling beams. Arthur flinched, his hand tightening on the book. The shelling was moving closer, walking down the communication trench in a creeping barrage. They would be coming over soon. The Hun always attacked after the rain started, using the noise to mask the sound of their boots in the mud. He should wake Socks. They needed to get the runner to the aid post before the stretcher-bearers were pinned down. He needed to get back to the front line to warn Bertie. But he stayed seated. The weight of the gloves against his chest felt like an anchor, dragging him down into a terrible, quiet acceptance. If Socks had already logged the gloves, then the outcome was written. The ledger did not predict, it recorded. It was a history of things that had already happened, even if the bodies were still walking around above ground. To wake Socks was to deny the truth of the book. To take the gloves to Julian was to pretend that the right one was not already lost somewhere in the wire, waiting for its match. "Julian," Arthur said, testing the name. It sounded thin, brittle. He opened the book to a blank page at the back. His pencil was short, barely more than a nub, but it would serve. He pressed the tip to the paper, the graphite scratching softly against the rough stock. He did not write a date. Dates were meaningless here. Time was measured in rations and rotations in the interval between shells. "Lt. J. Thorne," he wrote, mimicking Sock's careful script. "One friend alive." He stared at the words. They looked foolish, a child's attempt to make sense of a world that operated on laws of ballistics and attrition. He crossed them out, the graphite smearing into a dark blur. "One pair gloves, right." He added the line, completing the set. If Socks had the left, Arthur would carry the right. They would meet in the middle, somewhere in the mud, when the time came. It was a pact, silent and binding, forged in theft and grief. The rain intensified, hammering against the roof with a violence that made the timber groan. A shell landed close, the concussion popping Arthur's ears and sending a shower of dirt from the ceiling onto Sock's sleeping form. The runner did not wake, curled tight around his ledger as if it were an infant. Arthur closed the book and tucked it under Sock's arm, securing it against the runner's chest. He stood up, his joints cracking in the cold damp, and adjusted his tunic. The gloves sat heavy in his pocket, a lump of warmth against the chill that had settled deep in his bones. He picked up his rifle from the corner, checking the bolt out of habit, though he knew the mechanism was clean. "Sleep well, you mad bastard," he muttered. He stepped over Sock's legs, careful to avoid the bandaged calf, and moved towards the flap of the dugout. The noise outside was rising, a cacophony of whistles and shouts that signaled the start of the raid. The air rushing in through the opening smelled of cordite and wet earth, the breath of the battle waking up. Arthur paused at the threshold, his hand on the timber frame. He looked back once at the dark shape of his friend, clutching the inventory of the dead. Then he pulled his cap low, stepped out into the rain, and began to run towards the front line, the right glove pressing hard against his ribs with every stride. Rain needled the canvas flap, a relentless staccato drumming that drowned the softer sounds of breathing inside the dugout. Arthur paused on the top step, one boot in the mud, one on the timber, feeling the cold seep through the sole of his boot and bite at his ankle. He did not look back. Looking back invited the superstition that the trench might swallow him whole if he lingered too long in the doorway, that the earth itself was jealous of the living. Instead, he focused on the rhythm of his own boots, the squelch of mud sucking at the leather, the heavy thud of his rifle butt against his hip. Left, right, left. The communication trench was a river of churned clay, waist-high in places where the drainage had collapsed under the weight of the autumn downpour. Arthur waded through it, shoulders hunched against the spray kicked up by passing runners who shoved past him with wide, panicked eyes. No one spoke. Words were too expensive here, wasted on anything other than orders or prayers. A flare hissed overhead, casting a sickly magnesium glare that turned the mud to silver and the faces of the men to masks of grey ash. Arthur flattened himself against the wet sandbags, pressing his cheek into the slick, rotting wattle until the light faded. "Move it, Vance!" The shout came from ahead, a jagged tear in the noise. Sergeant Major Evans stood 10 yards up, a silhouette carved from the dark, his cap pulled low against the rain. He did not shout often. When he did, the sound carried the weight of a court-martial. Arthur pushed off the wall, his legs burning with the effort of lifting them from the suction of the trench floor. "Coming, Sarge." "Don't come, arrive." Evans turned, his back a rigid line of wool and authority, and vanished around the zigzag bend towards the front line. Arthur quickened his pace, the glove in his pocket thumping a dull, rhythmic beat against his thigh. Right, right, right. It felt obscene, carrying a single glove while men around him were losing limbs, heads, entire existences to the random arithmetic of the artillery. Socks had logged it. The ledger didn't lie. If the left glove was already inventory for the dead, then Julian was as good as gone, regardless of whether his heart was still beating in the dugout 200 yards back. The thought sat in Arthur's chest like a stone, cold and immovable. He reached the front line, Sector 4, the lip, and the air changed instantly. The smell of wet wool and cordite was replaced by the sweet, cloying stench of unburied flesh drifting over from no man's land, a scent that coated the back of the throat and refused to be swallowed. Men were crouched along the fire step, rifles resting on the parapet, their faces streaked with mud and exhaustion. Bertie Higgs was there, leaning against the trench wall, lighting a cigarette with hands that shook just enough to be noticeable if one was looking for it. Arthur was looking. "You're late, Titch," Bertie said, not turning his head. The flame of the match flared, illuminating the deep lines around his eyes, the grey stubble that made him look 10 years older than his 24. "Thought the Boche might have bagged you on the run-up. Wouldn't have blamed them. Poor form, getting caught in the open without a proper excuse." "Evans stopped me," Arthur lied, sliding into the space beside him. The mud immediately soaked through the seat of his trousers, cold and invasive. "Had to check the roster." "Roster?" Bertie snorted, a dry, humorless sound. "Paperwork. That's what wins wars, isn't it? Not bullets, not bayonets, just a nice neat list of who's supposed to die today." He took a long drag, the cherry of the cigarette glowing bright orange in the gloom, then exhaled a plume of smoke that mingled with the rain. "Socks make it back." "He's sleeping." Arthur kept his voice low, flat. "Legs bad, not critical." "Good lad." Bertie flicked the ash onto the wet floor, where it hissed and died. "He'll need both legs for the next bit. Heard the Jerrys are bringing up the big guns, Minenwerfers, nasty bits of kit. Throw a crate of high-explosive right into your lap and ask how your day's going." Arthur looked down the line. The wire was barely visible in the dark, a tangled scar against the slightly lighter grey of the sky. Somewhere out there, beyond the range of their rifles, the German listening posts were waiting. He could feel them, a presence as tangible as the man beside him. They were always there, watching, waiting for a mistake, a flash of metal, a cough. "Julian?" Arthur asked, the name slipping out before he could stop it. Bertie stiffened, just for a fraction of a second, a tightening of the shoulder muscles that anyone else would have missed. "Officer's dugout. Last I saw, writing letters, I reckon, or staring at the wall. Hard to tell the difference these days." He turned to Arthur, his eyes sharp, searching. "Why, you expecting him to come over the top with us?" "No," Arthur touched his pocket, feeling the wool through the fabric. "Just wondered." Well, don't. Bertie's voice dropped, losing its fatalistic edge, becoming something harder, more protective. He's got his own war to fight, Titch. Leave him to it. We've got ours. A whistle shrieked in the distance, followed by the familiar, terrifying whine of an incoming shell. The sound grew rapidly, a screaming violin note that pierced the rain and the noise of the trench. Down, Bertie yelled, grabbing Arthur by the collar and yanking him towards the fire step. They hit the mud together just as the world exploded. The concussion hit them an instant later, a physical blow that knocked the breath from their lungs and filled the air with dirt, shrapnel, and the shrieks of wounded men. Arthur curled into a ball, hands over his head, waiting for the end, waiting for the darkness to take him. The ground heaved beneath them, tossing them like toys in a bath. Mud rained down, choking, blinding, tasting of iron and decay. Then silence, not true silence, but the ringing absence of the explosion, broken by the groans of the injured and the frantic shouting of NCOs trying to restore order. Arthur pushed himself up, spitting grit from his mouth. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. He looked at Bertie. The corporal was covered in slime, his face pale, but he was moving, checking the men on either side of them. "Miller," Bertie shouted, his voice distorted by the ringing in Arthur's ears. "You intact?" Arthur nodded, though he wasn't sure if Bertie saw it. He patted his pockets, a reflexive check. The rifle was there, the bandolier was there, and the glove. The glove was still there, pressed against his ribs, dry and warm. He looked towards the officer's dugout, invisible in the smoke and rain. The ledger said the left glove was lost. He had the right. The set was incomplete. Until they were together, until the pair was whole, Julian couldn't be gone. It was a superstition, a child's logic, but it was all he had. "Bertie," Arthur said, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "The wire." Bertie followed his gaze. Through the clearing smoke, the tangled mass of barbed wire in front of the trench was shifting, not from the wind. Something was moving out there, crawling. "Jesus," Bertie whispered, raising his rifle. "They're already coming." Arthur raised his own weapon, the stock familiar and comforting against his shoulder. He peered through the sights, scanning the darkness beyond the wire. The rain blurred his vision, turning the world into a watercolor of gray and black. But there, in the dip of a shell crater, he saw a flash of movement, a helmet, a hand. He tightened his finger on the trigger. The glove in his pocket seemed to burn now, a brand against his skin. If Julian was lost, then this was how it ended. Not with a letter, not with a quiet moment in a dugout, but here, in the mud, with the rain and the steel and the screaming. "Wait for it," Bertie murmured, his voice steady now, the fatalism replaced by a cold, hard focus. "Wait until you see the whites of their eyes, or whatever's left of them." Arthur held his breath. The figure in the crater rose, silhouetted against a fresh flare. It wasn't a German. The tunic was wrong. The posture was wrong. It was a runner, stumbling towards the line, waving something white in the air. Not a surrender flag, a piece of paper. Arthur lowered his rifle slightly, confusion cutting through the adrenaline. "Bertie, look." "I see it," Bertie said, his finger still tight on the trigger. "Don't shoot, not yet." The runner slipped in the mud, fell, scrambled up again, dragging a leg that looked badly twisted. He was coming straight for their sector, straight for them. Arthur felt a sudden, terrible certainty settle over him, heavier than the rain, colder than the mud. The ledger was updating, the inventory was changing, and the price was about to be paid in full. A runner collapsed 3 yards from the fire step, knees hitting the slurry with a wet slap that sounded louder than the distant shelling. He didn't cry out, just lay there, chest heaving against the churned earth, one hand clutching a folded sheet of paper as if it were a lifebelt in a drowning sea. "Miller," Bertie's voice cut through the ringing in Arthur's ears, sharp and stripped of its usual humor. "You intact?" Arthur nodded, though the motion felt stiff, mechanical. He patted his tunic pocket. The wool was damp, but the shape beneath remained solid. The glove, still there, pressed against his ribs like a second heart, dry and warm despite the rain soaking through his uniform. "Don't just sit gawping, Vance." Bertie scrambled over the parapet, rifle butt leading, and grabbed the runner by the collar of his tunic. Drag him in before the Boche spots us playing nursemaid. Arthur moved. His boots sank into the mud, each step a sucking struggle against the trench floor that seemed determined to keep him rooted. He reached the man, hooked an arm under the runner's armpit, and together they hauled the stumbling figure back into the relative safety of the ditch. The runner's leg dragged uselessly, boot missing, sock torn to ribbons revealing skin grey as wet slate. "Message," the runner gasped, shoving the paper into Arthur's hand before collapsing against the sandbag wall. "From Evans, for the whole bloody lot of you." Arthur looked down at the sheet. It was typewritten, the ink stark black against the pale, rain-spotted paper. No handwriting, no personal scrawl from Julian, just the rigid, impersonal geometry of the company sergeant major's orders. Operation Order Number 44. Objective Beaumont Hamel. 0 hour 7:20. Platoon strength reformed under new designation. He scanned the lines, searching for names. Sox Miller, Lieutenant Thorne, Corporal Higgs, Private Vance. Nothing, just numbers. A roster of replacements, fresh faces plugged into the holes left by the dead, as if the men who had breathed this air yesterday were merely broken cogs swapped out for new ones in a machine that refused to stop grinding. "Reformed," Arthur whispered, the word tasting of ash. "He's reformed us already." Bertie wiped mud from his face with a sleeve that was more brown than khaki. "Don't take it personal, Titch. Evans writes orders, not eulogies. If he started listing the missing, he'd need a quire of paper just for Tuesday." "It's not Tuesday." Arthur's finger traced the typed line where his own number should have been, finding only a blank space where a name ought to sit. "It's Thursday, and Julian isn't missing. He's in the dugout. He's writing music in his head and forging reports." "Is he now?" Bertie's eyes narrowed, the fatigue etching deep lines around them. "Then why ain't he here to read the order himself? Why send a runner with a busted leg and a sheet of paper that smells of fresh ink?" Arthur had no answer. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the drip of water from the parapet and the ragged breathing of the injured runner. Somewhere down the line, a rifle cracked, the sound sharp and lonely in the grey dawn. "He's hiding," Arthur said finally, his voice low. "The MO is looking for him. If Evans puts his name on a casualty list, they'll send a stretcher-bearer party. If they find him sane enough to walk, they'll ship him back to Blighty. Julian knows that. He's staying off the books." "Or he's gone," Bertie said, not unkindly. "And Evans is just tidying up the mess before the officers come to count the bodies." "No," Arthur crumpled the order in his fist, the paper resisting then yielding with a crisp tear. "I have the glove. The left one is lost. The ledger said so, but I have the right. As long as I have this, he's not gone. The set isn't complete. You can't close the inventory on a man while he's still got half a pair of gloves walking about." Bertie stared at him for a long moment, then looked away, focusing on cleaning the mud from his rifle bolt. "Keep your superstitions if they help you sleep, Titch. Just don't let them get you killed come 0 hour." Arthur unfolded the crumpled order again, smoothing the creases with trembling fingers. The rain had begun to fall harder now, a steady drizzle that turned the typed words into a blur of running ink. Beaumont Hamel. The name meant nothing to him, just another village on a map he'd never seen, another patch of French soil to be chewed up and spat out by the artillery. But the silence of the document screamed louder than any barrage. It was a silence of erasure, a bureaucratic deletion of everything they had been, everything they had suffered together in the dark hours between posts. He thought of Elsie, of the letter in his pocket, the one he hadn't finished, the one where he was going to tell her about the color of the sky, how it wasn't grey at all but a peculiar bruised purple before the sun came up, like a plum left out too long. He had wanted to write that the mud smelled different today, less of rot and more of wet iron, like old pennies, small things, trivial things. The kind of details that made a person real, that proved they existed beyond the numbers on Evans' typewriter. "Vance," Bertie's hand landed on his shoulder, heavy and grounding. "Save the reading for later. Check your ammo. Make sure your rifle ain't full of muck. 0 hour is coming whether we're ready or not." Arthur nodded, tucking the order into his tunic next to the glove. The paper felt cold against his chest, a stark contrast to the warmth of the wool enclosing Julian's possession. He checked his bandolier, the brass cartridges gleaming dully in the half-light. One by one, he touched them, counting silently, 20 rounds, enough for a minute of fighting, maybe less. The runner groaned, shifting his weight against the sandbags. "Socks," he mumbled, eyes half closed. Socks said, "Tell Arthur." Arthur leaned in, ear close to the man's cracked lips. "What did he say, Miller? What did Socks say?" "Said, found the jam," the runner whispered, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Strawberry for the officers, said, tell Arthur, it's safe." Then his head lolled back, unconsciousness claiming him before he could say more. Arthur sat back on his haunches, the rain dripping from the brim of his helmet onto his nose. Strawberry jam, Socks code, it's safe. But what was safe? The dugout? The route forward? Or was it just another of Socks' jokes, a final piece of larceny to lighten the mood before the whistle blew? He looked at Bertie. The corporal was watching the runner, his expression unreadable. "He's lying," Bertie said softly. "Socks never gives anything away for free. If he sent word about jam, it means he's found something else, something he couldn't carry." Arthur felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach, heavier than the mud in his boots. The ledger was updating again. The inventory was changing. And the price was about to be paid in full, not in jam, but in flesh and bone, and the silent, typewritten orders that turned men into numbers before they were even dead. He reached into his pocket again, fingers brushing the woolen glove. It felt smaller now, or perhaps his hand had grown numb. Outside the trench, the rain continued to fall, washing the blood from the parapet into the duckboards, turning the whole world into a river of red and brown that flowed inexorably towards the sea. 0 hour, Bertie said, checking his wristwatch, the glass face cracked but the hands still moving. 5 minutes. Arthur picked up his pen. He had to finish the letter. If he didn't write it now, he never would. He balanced the notebook on his knee, the paper damp and buckling, and pressed the nib to the page. The ink flowed, dark and permanent, tracing the curve of a word that felt suddenly insufficient for everything he needed to say. "Dearest Elsie." The rain fell harder, blurring the edges of the world, turning the trench into a tunnel of grey mist where nothing was certain except the ticking of the watch and the cold weight of the glove against his heart. The nib scratched, a dry scraping sound against the wet paper. "Dearest Elsie." He stopped there, the ink pooled at the tail of the E, a black tear swelling until gravity dragged it down the fiber of the page, ruining the margin. Arthur wiped the spot with his thumb, smearing it into a grey bruise that looked too much like the sky he had meant to describe. The purple plum, the bruised fruit hanging over Thiepval, gone now, washed away by the drizzle that seeped through his tunic collar and ran in cold rivulets down his spine. 3 minutes, Bertie said. He did not look up. The corporal was ramming a cleaning rod into the barrel of his Lee Enfield, the metal clacking against wood with a rhythmic, hollow thud. Thud, pause, thud. "Make it count, Titch. Don't waste the lead on a greeting if you've no breath left for the news." "There is no news," Arthur said. His voice sounded thin, stripped of the resonance that usually filled the dugout when Julian played the fool. "Only the mud and the rain." "Tell her about the jam, then." Bertie yanked the rod free, inspected the rag on the end, and tossed it into the slurry at their feet. "Strawberry, rare stuff. She'll want to know we ate well before the push. Keeps the worry down in Camden Town." "She knows we don't eat jam, Bertie. Not unless Socks has pinched it from a general's table." "Exactly." Bertie racked the bolt, the brass cartridge gleaming for a second before vanishing into the chamber. "So tell her we dined like kings. Tell her the officers shared their reserves. A nice lie, costs nothing." Arthur looked at the runner slumped against the sandbags. The man's chest rose and fell in shallow, rattling hitches. Strawberry jam, it tasted of sugar and deceit. Socks Miller would not have sent word of a luxury unless the cellar was already compromised, unless the route back to the battalion HQ was cut, blocked by debris or dead men. It's safe. The code meant the opposite. It meant the larder was bare, the theft complete, the exit sealed. Socks was telling him there would be no retreat. No runners coming back with mail, no fresh rations. just the line and the wire and the order typed on Evan's machine. He pressed the pen to the paper again, the nib caught on a rough patch of pulp. "The weather here is tolerable," he wrote. The lie tasted like copper in his mouth. "The autumn colors are quite striking, despite the conditions." "Liar," Bertie muttered, though there was no heat in it. He checked his watch again, tapping the cracked glass face with a fingernail. 2 minutes, and the light is failing. Soon it will be just the flares and the flash of the guns. Arthur ignored him. He needed to get to the end, to the signature. If he could sign his name, he existed. If the ink dried on the page, he had been here in this trench with this mud before the earth swallowed him whole. He wrote faster now, the letters sloping downward as his hand cramped. "I have kept Julian's glove, the right one. He will need it when the frost comes. I am holding it for him." A lie for Elsie. Julian was not coming back from the dugout. The silence from that direction had stretched too long, broken only by the distant, muffled thump of heavy-caliber shells landing near the reserve lines. Julian was either gone, or he was hiding in the dark, forging his own fitness reports while the world collapsed above him. Arthur could not tell Elsie that her brother's friend was unraveling, that the officer who once quoted Horace in the mess was now hearing violins in the barbed wire. He could not write that the man who taught him to tie a proper knot was likely staring at a blank wall, waiting for the ceiling to fall. "1 minute," Bertie said. His voice dropped an octave, losing the casual edge. "Cap on your pen, Titch. Pocket it. We go over on the whistle." Arthur did not cap the pen. He dragged it across the page, the ink skipping as his hand shook. "Do not worry about the post. It is merely delayed. We are all quite well." The words blurred. The rain had found the notebook, saturating the edges until the paper felt like wet cloth. He tried to write love, but the L dissolved into a streak of black. "Vance," Bertie grabbed his arm. The grip was iron-tight, fingers digging into the bicep through the wet wool. "Put it away, now." "I haven't finished," Arthur said. He tried to pull free, but Bertie held firm. "There is no finishing," Bertie snapped. "There is only going. You want her to have a letter, then live long enough to post it yourself. Don't die scribbling nonsense about plum-colored skies." Arthur stared at him. The corporal's face was grey, streaked with mud, the eyes hollowed out by weeks of no sleep and too much fear, but the jaw was set. The loyalty was there, rigid and unyielding as the bayonet fixed to his rifle. Bertie would go over, he would climb the ladder, he would walk into the machine gun fire if that was what the order demanded, and he would expect Arthur to do the same. The whistle shrieked. It was a high, piercing sound that cut through the drumming of the rain and the low moan of the wind. It did not sound human. It sounded like a kettle boiling dry, a scream of metal on metal. Arthur dropped the pen. It fell into the mud beside his boot, the nib instantly clogged with brown sludge. He did not reach for it. He could not. His legs felt heavy, anchored to the duckboards by the weight of the glove in his tunic and the unfinished letter on his knee. "Up," Bertie roared. He was already moving, scrambling onto the fire step, his boots finding purchase on the slippery wood. "Over, get over." The runner groaned, a low, animal sound, but no one turned to help him. There was no time. The trench erupted into motion, a sudden surge of khaki and steel as men surged forward, driven by the momentum of the whistle and the terror of staying still. Arthur was shoved from behind, a nameless pressure against his back that forced him up the steps. He reached the parapet. The world opened up. Noise hit him first, a wall of sound, physical and crushing, that battered against his eardrums. The barrage had lifted, creating a curtain of fire ahead, but the German guns were answering, shells screaming overhead in a chaotic arc that turned the air into a living thing. The sky was not purple. It was a churning mess of grey smoke and orange flash, lit up by the detonations that walked across the ground like giants. "Keep moving," someone shouted, a voice he did not recognize. Arthur climbed. His hands gripped the ladder rungs, slick with slime. He pulled himself up, inch by inch, until his head cleared the top of the trench. No man's land lay before him. A wasteland of craters and tangled wire, illuminated by the sporadic flare of starshells that hung suspended in the rain, casting long, dancing shadows. Bodies were already down, some moving, some still. The wire sang, just as Julian had said, a dreadful violin concerto of snapping metal and whistling bullets. Arthur stepped out onto the mud. It sucked at his boots, clinging with a greedy, possessive strength. He took another step, then another. Beside him, Bertie was shouting something, pointing forward, his face a mask of grim determination. Arthur looked down. The letter was still in his hand. He had grabbed it without thinking, the damp paper clutched in his fist like a talisman. He tried to open his fingers to let it go, to lighten the load, but his hand would not obey. The muscles locked. A bullet cracked past his ear, close enough to sting. Then another, the air around him filled with the buzz of angry insects. "Down!" Bertie yelled, throwing himself into a shell hole. Arthur stumbled. His foot caught on a root or perhaps a bone, and he went down hard, the breath knocked out of him. The mud rushed up to meet his face, cold and smelling of iron and rot. He rolled, trying to find cover, trying to find the bottom of the crater. The letter slipped from his grip. It landed on a sandbag at the lip of the hole, exposed to the driving rain. The ink ran freely now, the word love dissolving into a shapeless blur, the name Elsie fading into the brown wash of the storm. Arthur reached for it, stretching his fingers, but an explosion nearby threw a shower of earth over them, burying the paper under a fresh layer of chalk and clay. He lay there, gasping, the mud filling his mouth. Above him, the whistle blew again, distant and ignored, swallowed by the roar of the guns. The world narrowed to the hole, the rain, and the silence of the order that had sent them here. Bertie's hand appeared in his vision, grabbing his tunic collar. "Move, Titch," the corporal screamed, his voice barely audible over the din. "For God's sake, move." Arthur looked at the spot where the letter had been. Nothing remained but mud. The inventory was updating. The ledger was closing. He pushed himself up, leaving the paper behind, and followed Bertie into the smoke. The mud tasted of old pennies and rotted turnips. Arthur spat, but the grit clung to his tongue, a gritty film that no amount of swallowing could shift. He pushed himself up on elbows that trembled with a violence he could not command, the weight of his wet tunic dragging at his shoulders like a leaden shroud. "Move," Bertie's voice was a ragged tear in the fabric of the noise, barely distinguishable from the cracking whip of the Mauser bullets slicing the air above their heads. Arthur scrambled forward, knees sinking into the slick clay until the cold seeped through the puttees, numbing the bone. He crawled towards the lip of the crater where Bertie crouched, a huddled shape against the churned earth, rifle butt jammed hard against a shoulder that twitched with every impact nearby. The world had shrunk to the dimensions of this hole, a pit no wider than a London bus, yet it felt vast in its capacity to swallow them whole. Something tugged at his peripheral vision, a flash of white against the brown. Arthur froze. His hand, moving of its own accord, reached out past the safety of the crater's edge, fingers stretching into the open, killing rain. "Don't be a bloody fool," Bertie lunged, grabbing Arthur's ankle, yanking him back with a force that scraped the skin from his shin. "You want a header from Fritz? Stay down." "It's there," Arthur gasped, the words tearing from a throat raw with smoke. "The letter." "Let it rot." Bertie shoved him flat as a shell burst 30 yards off, a geyser of water and chalk raining down upon them, filling their collars with freezing sludge. "It's just paper, Titch, just paper." But it wasn't. It was the only thing that proved Elsie existed, that Bloomsbury existed, that there was a world where the pavement was dry and the postman knocked on a door that hadn't been splintered by high explosive. Arthur writhed against Bertie's grip, desperate, the need to retrieve those smudged words burning hotter than the fear of death. He twisted, breaking the hold, and surged upward again, half crawling, half sliding towards the sandbag where the notebook lay. The rain hammered the page. The ink, already bleeding, ran in rivulets, turning the careful script of my dearest Elsie into a weeping black wound. The word love, the final promise he had struggled to form, dissolved completely, leaving only a shapeless stain that mirrored the chaos of the ground around it. Arthur's fingers brushed the corner of the page. He hooked it, dragging it towards him, the paper tearing slightly under the strain. A crack, sharp, close. The sandbag beside his hand exploded into a cloud of hessian and dirt. The shockwave threw him backward, tumbling him into the bottom of the crater where he landed hard on his side, the breath driven from his lungs in a painful whoosh. The torn fragment of the letter fluttered from his grasp, landing face down in the water that pooled at their feet. Bertie was on him instantly, tackling him into the mud, covering Arthur's head with his own body as another barrage walked closer, the ground jumping beneath them like a living thing possessed of a violent temper. "Stay down," Bertie roared into his ear, the heat of his breath mingling with the cold rain. "You stupid, stubborn bastard, stay down." Arthur lay still, pinned under the weight of his friend, listening to the rhythmic thump of shells landing in a creeping line that marched steadily towards their position. The sound was mechanical, indifferent, a great iron roller flattening everything in its path. He could feel the vibration of it in his teeth, a dull ache that resonated through his skull, but he did not flinch. He stared at the muddy water swirling around them, watching the torn scrap of paper sink slowly, the fibers bloating until it was indistinguishable from the refuse of the battlefield. The inventory was updating, the ledger was closing. Sox Miller would have made a joke about it, something about the cost of stationery versus the price of a life, his cockney grin flashing white in the gloom before he vanished down a communication trench with a stolen bottle of wine tucked under his arm. Julian would have written a sonnet about the drowning ink, finding some terrible beauty in the way the words dissolved, his handwriting spiraling into madness even as the syntax held firm. But Sox was somewhere in the smoke, likely running a message he'd never deliver, and Julian was in that dugout 200 yards back, staring at a telephone that rang with music only he could hear. There was only Bertie and the mud and the order. The shelling lifted, shifting its focus deeper into the British lines, a sudden cessation of noise that felt louder than the bombardment itself. The silence was heavy, pregnant with the expectation of the next wave, the next command, the next inevitable surge of men over the parapet to meet the machine guns. Bertie rolled off him, sitting up and wiping a smear of clay from his eyes. He looked at Arthur, his expression unreadable in the grey light, the lines of his face etched deep with a fatigue that went beyond mere sleeplessness. "You all right?" Bertie asked. His voice was flat, devoid of the earlier panic, returning to that strange, fatalistic calm that had kept them alive through the Somme worst weeks. Arthur nodded. He couldn't speak. His throat was tight, constricted by the dust and the unreleased scream that sat lodged there. He looked at his hands. They were shaking, covered in the same brown sludge that coated everything else, the nails broken, the skin raw. "Good," Bertie said. He checked his rifle, working the bolt with a practiced snap, the metal gleaming dull and oily in the rain. "Because we're going again. Evans won't have it any other way." Arthur looked towards the parapet. Through the gap in the crater wall, he could see the line of men forming up, a ragged column of khaki ghosts emerging from the mist, moving with a slow, hypnotic rhythm towards the wire. They did not shout. They did not cheer. They simply walked, step after heavy step, into the grey curtain of smoke that hid the German lines. "The order," Arthur whispered. The words felt strange in his mouth, alien and hollow. "The order," Bertie confirmed. He stood up, offering a hand to Arthur. The grip was firm, grounding, a tether to the present moment when every instinct screamed to run, to hide, to dive back into the earth and never surface. "Come on, Titch. Best not keep the sergeant major waiting. He dislikes tardiness almost as much as he dislikes survivors." Arthur took the hand. He pulled himself up, his legs feeling like wood, disconnected from his will. He glanced once more at the spot where the letter had fallen. Nothing remained. The rain had washed it away, or the mud had swallowed it, or perhaps it had never existed at all, just a figment of a mind breaking under the strain of the endless autumn. He turned his back on the crater. He adjusted the strap of his rifle, feeling the familiar weight of the wood against his shoulder, the cold steel of the bayonet pressing against his hip. "Right," Arthur said. His voice was steady now, stripped of everything but the necessity of the next step. "Let's go." They climbed out of the hole together, joining the line, merging into the stream of men moving towards the wire, towards the singing metal, towards the silence that waited on the other side. The rain continued to fall, washing the blood from the chalk, cleansing nothing, erasing no one, just adding to the endless, churning mud of the Somme. Behind them, on the sandbag, a single drop of water fell from the lip of the trench, landing precisely where the word love had been, completing the erasure. The ink had dried to a brittle crust on the nib, resisting the fresh dip into the pot with a stubbornness that felt personal, as if the instrument itself refused to commit another lie to paper. Corporal Bertie Higgs sat on the edge of a camp bed in the transit depot at Etaples, the frame groaning under a weight that was mostly bone and damp wool, while outside the canvas flap, a grey English rain fell with a polite, persistent rhythm that bore no resemblance to the violent deluge of the Somme. He capped the bottle. It was November now, 3 weeks since the battalion had been pulled out of the line near Beaumont-Hamel to be shredded and reconstituted like so much butcher's meat, and the quiet of this rear echelon felt less like peace and more like a holding pattern before the next slaughter. Bertie rubbed his thumb over the cover of the small notebook he had rescued from Arthur's tunic pocket, the leather swollen and warped from its time in the mud, the pages sticking together in clumps that required a knife blade to separate without tearing the fibers. "Dear Mrs. Vance," he wrote, the letters forming a careful, rounded script that belied the tremor in his hand, a handwriting learned not in the classroom, but in the long, cold watches of the trench where legibility was the only defense against madness. He paused, lifting the pen to inspect a speck of dried clay embedded in the ferrule, a souvenir from Sector 4 that no amount of scrubbing with issue soap seemed to shift. The room smelled of wet canvas, boot polish, and the sharp, chemical tang of the disinfectant used to spray the men upon arrival, a scent that clung to the back of the throat and promised cleanliness while delivering nothing but a sterile sort of decay. "You will find enclosed the personal effects of your son, Private Arthur Vance, though I must apologize for the condition of the notebook, which took a bath in a shell crater and smells rather strongly of cordite and old cheese." Bertie stopped, reading the line back, hearing the flatness of it, the way the horror was sanded down into a polite inconvenience suitable for a widow in Bloomsbury who expected her son's death to arrive in a neat envelope with a royal seal. He crossed out old cheese and wrote damp earth, then crossed that out too, leaving the sentence hanging unfinished as he reached for the second item he had tucked inside his tunic, a smaller, thinner sheaf of papers bound together with a piece of frayed red string. This was the ledger Socks Miller's inventory of the dead, recovered from the runner's body when they found him tangled in the wire 2 days after the push, the pages stiff with blood, but the columns still legible to those who knew the code. Bertie turned to a fresh page in his own letter, the paper rough and grey, the sort of stuff that absorbed ink like a sponge, blurring the edges of his words until they looked like smoke. "It occurs to me that the official report will tell you he died doing his duty, which is true enough in the broad sense, but it won't tell you that he spent the last hour sharing a tin of peaches with a boy from Liverpool who had forgotten his own ration, nor will it mention that he laughed when a whiz-bang took the top off the dugout, saying only that the Boche had finally decided to send us a proper parcel." He dipped the pen again, the ink well running low, the liquid thick and sluggish. "There are things the War Office cannot record, madam, specific debts and credits that exist only in the memory of those who remain, and since I appear to be the last one left from our immediate circle, I feel compelled to settle the accounts before my own turn comes." Bertie glanced at the ledger open on his knee, the handwriting jagged and hurried, Socks' distinctive scrawl listing items that ranged from the mundane to the absurd. Item 1 pair officers' socks silk, owner LT, Thorn, status, missing, presumed worn by Socks until hole appeared in left heel. Item 1 tin plum and apple jam, owner Capt. Davies, status, consumed by T. Miller and T. Vance 14th October. Item 1 silver cigarette case, owner LT, Thorn, status, buried with owner Thiepful. He traced the line for Julian Thorn with a calloused finger, feeling the indentation where Socks had pressed hard, perhaps knowing even then that the lieutenant's name would soon be nothing more than an entry in a book kept by a thief. Socks Miller, whom Arthur often chided for his larceny, kept a list of everything he ever borrowed or stole, intending to repay it all when we got back to Blighty, a notion so wildly optimistic it almost makes me weep to think of it now. Bertie looked up at the canvas wall, watching a raindrop trace a path through the grime, mimicking the trajectory of a shell he had seen arc over the lip of the trench just weeks ago, beautiful and terrible in its geometry. He has noted that your son owed him 6 pence for a bar of chocolate and a share of a bully beef ration, a debt I have taken the liberty of settling from my own pay, as I suspect Arthur would not wish to leave this world with an outstanding balance to a Cockney runner. The silence in the hut was heavy, broken only by the scratch of his pen and the distant murmur of men talking in the next bay, voices low and tentative, as if they were afraid that speaking too loudly might summon the artillery back. Bertie turned the page of the ledger, finding the final entry, written in a hand that was shaking so violently the letters barely resembled English. Item 1, unsent letter to Miss Elsie Vance. Owner, T. A. Vance. Status, in possession of C.P.L. Higgs, to be delivered by hand. He closed the ledger, the sound sharp in the quiet room, a full stop to a sentence that had no end. Arthur wrote to his sister, Elsie, in the days before the final advance, a letter he never posted, perhaps fearing the censor would flag his honesty, or perhaps simply because he ran out of time. Bertie reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded sheet, the paper soft and worn from being carried close to the heart, the creases white and fragile. He did not open it. That was not his place. The words inside belonged to Elsie, to the girl in Camden Town who waited for a postman who would never come with the news she dreaded, and to break that seal would be to steal something far more valuable than jam or silk socks. I shall keep this safe until I can deliver it to her personally, as I intend to call upon your household once my own discharge papers are processed, assuming the medical board does not decide to keep me for observation. He smiled then, a thin, humorless stretching of the lips that did not reach his eyes, the expression of a man who has seen too much to believe in simple outcomes. It seems a small thing, to walk from the depot to Bloomsbury, yet it feels like a journey greater than the one we made to France, for I carry with me the history of 4 men who are now nothing more than names on a list and memories in a notebook. Bertie looked down at the letter to Mrs. Vance, seeing the ink beginning to feather where his hand had rested too long, a blot spreading like a bruise across the page. He picked up the pen again, forcing himself to write the closing lines, the formalities that society demanded even when the world had ended. Please accept my deepest condolences, though I know such words are poor currency for the loss of a son, and know that Arthur was loved by his comrades in a way that the official records will never capture. He signed his name, C.P.L. B. Higgs, the letters bold and clear, a final act of defiance against the erasure that waited for them all. Your obedient servant, he whispered, the words tasting of ash and dust. Bertie folded the letter, tucking it along with the notebook and the ledger into a plain brown envelope, the paper coarse and unyielding under his fingers. He sealed it with a dab of glue, pressing the flap down firmly, then reached for the stamp that lay on the table, a small red rectangle bearing the profile of the king, a face that looked out with blind, imperial calm. He licked the gum, the taste sweet and cloying, and pressed the stamp onto the corner of the envelope, smoothing it down with his thumb until it was fixed, immutable, part of the machine now. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the mud from the roads, cleansing the tires of the lorries, scrubbing the world clean for the next batch of boys arriving from the depots, ready to be fed into the grinder. Bertie picked up the envelope, feeling its weight, slight and insignificant in his palm, yet heavy with the burden of everything that had happened and everything that had been lost. He stood up, his joints popping, the stiffness of the cold settling into his bones, and walked towards the door, towards the post box that stood in the corner of the hut, waiting to swallow the history of the platoon whole. The ledger lay open on the table, its pages swollen with damp, the ink bleeding into the fibers like old wounds refusing to scab over. Bertie pressed a thumb against the paper, feeling the rough grain of it, the way it resisted his touch, as if it knew what secrets it held. "Plum and apple," he murmured, the words catching in his throat, dry as the dust that had coated them all during those first weeks in July. He traced the line again. Item, 1 tin plum and apple jam. Owner, Capt. Davies. Status, consumed by T. Miller and T. Vance, 14th October. A ridiculous thing to remember, a tin of jam. Yet here it was, preserved in Sox Miller's jagged hand, more permanent than the men who had eaten it. Davies was gone, blown into the chalk near Thiepval before the leaves had even turned. Miller lay somewhere near Beaumont Hamel, likely still wearing the tunic he'd stolen the jam in. And Arthur. Arthur was here, in this room, in the form of a notebook tucked inside Bertie's tunic pocket, warm against his ribs. Sox believed in accounting, Bertie said to the empty hut, his voice flat, devoid of the humor that used to cushion the blow of bad news. Said a man couldn't vanish proper if his debts were still outstanding. He turned the page, the paper crinkled, stiff with dried mud. Item, 1 silver cigarette case. Owner, L.T. Thorne. Status, buried with owner, Thiepval. Bertie stopped. His finger hovered over the name. Julian Thorne, the boy from Bloomsbury who had played the violin before the war, who had written letters in a hand so elegant it looked like engraving, now just an entry in a thief's book. The cigarette case had been silver, engraved with Julian's initials. Bertie remembered the way Julian used to polish it, even in the trench, even when the mud was halfway to his knees. A futile gesture, polishing silver while the world ended. He kept this one off the list, Bertie whispered, tapping the line. Sox knew better than to steal from the dead. Or perhaps he had tried. Perhaps he had taken it, felt the weight of it in his palm, and then put it back. Sox had his own code, written in grease pencil and stolen rations. He stole to survive, not to profane. There was a difference, though the adjutant wouldn't see it. The adjutant saw only theft. Sox saw memory. Bertie shifted in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. His leg throbbed, a dull ache where a shard of shrapnel had grazed him 3 weeks prior. The wound was healing, leaving a pink scar that pulled when he walked. He rubbed it through his trousers, a nervous habit. 6 pence, he said, reading the next line, for a bar of chocolate. Item, 1 bar Cadbury's Dairy Milk. Owner, T. Miller. Status, consumed by T. Vance. Debt, 6 pence. Arthur owed a dead man 6 pence. The absurdity of it struck Bertie like a physical blow, winding him. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his head in his hands. The hut smelled of wet wool and carbolic soap, the standard scent of the depot, but underneath it, he could still smell the somme, the sweet, cloying stench of unburied flesh, the cordite, the damp earth. He meant to pay it, Bertie said, lifting his head. Arthur meant to pay it all back. He turned another page. The entries became sporadic towards the end, the handwriting deteriorating into a scrawl that barely resembled English. Sock's hand had been shaking, or perhaps he had been writing in the dark, huddled in a dugout while the earth shook above them. Item, 1 unsent letter to Miss Elsie Vance. Owner, T. A. Vance. Status, in possession of C.P.L. Higgs, to be delivered by hand. Bertie closed his eyes. The rain outside picked up, drumming against the canvas roof, a steady rhythm that matched the beat of his own heart. Elsie Vance, the girl in Camden Town. She would be waiting for the postman. She would be wearing black already, though the official telegram hadn't arrived yet. Women knew. They always knew before the paper came. "I'll take it to her," Bertie said, the promise hanging in the air between him and the ledger. "I'll walk to Camden. I'll stand on her doorstep." He opened his eyes and looked at the ledger again. There was one more item, tucked into the back cover, folded small and precise, not written in Sock's hand, typed, the sharp, clean impression of a typewriter ribbon stark against the muddy pages. Bertie reached for it, his fingers trembling slightly. He pulled the slip of paper free. Memorandum. To Company Records. From SGT, Madge Evans. Date 12 November 1916. Ray Casualty List 4B. Status Final. No names, just numbers. Killed in action 42, wounded 18, missing 7. The numbers sat on the page like tombstones, clean and unadorned. Evans never wasted words. He never added flourishes. He never said sorry. He just recorded the loss and moved on. The machine required fuel, and men were the fuel. 42, Bertie said, the number tasting of iron. 7 missing. He knew who the 7 were. He didn't need the names. He could see their faces. Socks with his crooked grin, Julian with his shaking hands, Arthur with his quiet wit. They were in the missing column or the killed one. It didn't matter. The result was the same. Bertie folded the memorandum and placed it back inside the ledger. He closed the book, the sound sharp in the quiet room, a full stop. He looked at the letter to Mrs. Vance, sitting on the table beside the ledger. The ink was still wet in places, feathering into the paper where his hand had rested. He had written the words. He had signed his name, but it wasn't enough. Words were thin things. They broke against the reality of the numbers on Evans' slip. Socks kept the ledger, Bertie said, his voice low. Evans kept the count. He picked up his pen. The nib was scratched, leaving a thin line of ink that threatened to snag on the paper. He dipped it into the inkwell, watching the black liquid cling to the metal. "I keep the rest," he whispered. He looked down at the ledger one last time. The items listed there were trivial: jam, chocolate, a cigarette case, but they were real. They were proof that men had lived there, that they had eaten and smoked and owed debts to one another. Evans' memorandum listed the dead. Sock's ledger listed the living. Bertie capped the pen. He pushed the ledger aside and drew the letter closer. He needed to finish it. He needed to tell Mrs. Vance that her son was loved, that he wasn't just a number on a list. But how do you say that? How do you put the weight of a friendship into an envelope? He picked up the pen again. His hand hovered over the page. "Dear Mrs. Vance," he wrote, the letters forming slowly, "I am writing to you because Arthur asked me to." It wasn't true. Arthur hadn't asked. Arthur was dead, but it was the truth nonetheless. Arthur's life demanded a witness. Bertie was the only one left. He wrote for a while, the scratch of the pen filling the hut. He wrote about the jam. He wrote about the chocolate. He wrote about the debt. He didn't mention the mud. He didn't mention the smell. He didn't mention the numbers on Evans' slip. When he finished, he set the pen down. His hand cramped, the fingers stiff and cold. He blew on the ink, watching it dry. Outside, the rain continued to fall. It washed the roads. It washed the tires of the lorries. It washed the world clean for the next batch of boys. Bertie picked up the letter. He folded it, sharp and precise. He tucked it into the envelope. He didn't seal it yet. He reached into his tunic pocket and pulled out Arthur's notebook. It was damp, the corners curled. He placed it inside the envelope, on top of the letter. It fit snugly, like a heart in a chest. He picked up the ledger. He couldn't send this. This was his. This was the memory he had to carry. He tucked the ledger under his arm and stood up. His joints popped. The stiffness of the cold settled into his bones. He walked towards the door, towards the post box that stood in the corner of the hut. He stopped before the box. It was painted green, the paint peeling in strips, a slit in the top, dark and waiting. Bertie looked at the envelope in his hand. It was slight and insignificant in his palm, yet it was heavy, heavy with the burden of everything that had happened, heavy with the names of the dead. He dropped it into the box. It fell with a soft thud, disappearing into the dark. He stood there for a moment, listening. No sound, just the rain. He turned away from the box and walked back to the table. He opened the ledger again. He needed to check the numbers. He needed to make sure he hadn't forgotten anyone. He ran his finger down the list. Jam, cigarette case, chocolate, letter. He stopped at the bottom of the page. There was one more entry, written in a hand he didn't recognize, faint, barely legible. Item 1 memory, owner CPL, Higgs, status, ongoing. Bertie stared at the words. He hadn't written them. Socks hadn't written them. He touched the paper. It was dry. Who wrote that? He asked the empty room. No answer, just the rain. He closed the ledger, he tucked it under his arm, he walked towards the door. He had a journey to make, a journey to Bloomsbury, a journey to Camden Town, a journey to deliver the truth. He stepped outside, the rain hit his face, cold and sharp. He pulled his collar up, he started walking. He didn't look back at the hut, he didn't look back at the post box, he just walked. The road stretched out before him, long and grey. It led to London, it led home. He walked. The Girouard Cipher is not a documentary record. It is a work of historical fiction, grounded in the real life and surviving wartime letters and records of Talbot Papineau, Canadian officer. The names, dates, places, campaigns and outcomes are faithful to the historical record. The dialogue, the private scenes and the inner life are imagined, dramatized, not documented. Where the story departs from the verifiable facts, the liberty is the author's own. The history behind it draws on these real sources. Recurring jokes in Private Eye. Percy Girouard. Primary material researched via the Internet Archive. Context via Wikipedia.